Solarpunk. Chapter 11. Jessica began by explaining who she and her father really were. Ezra's eyes sparkled with delight at hearing that the girl was an undercover agent looking for dangerous secrets. Jessica must have embellished it a bit. Ruth knew that there was no way a girl her age was actually a trained and dangerous government agent. Though Ruth had to admit that she was way smarter and more capable than anyone else Ruth had ever met. The explanation that Michael was working for a government agency intending to root out the corruption of Helianthus in one fell swoop also caused a great deal of excitement in Ruth's brother. A city free of dangerous criminals and rich scumbags lording their money over everyone sounded great on paper. Ezra practically gushed at the idea of a hero swooping in and taking out all the bad guys with ease. Hearing it again, Ruth was glad that Jessica had offered to get them out of the city. Without the gangs paying for siphoning work, Ruth would have a much harder time securing enough money to survive. No actual business would hire 2 kids off the street. Ruth didn't care about committing crimes as long as she could keep Ezra safe, but some of the only options that would be left after the gangs were rooted out were, well, that wasn't going to happen for a lot of reasons. If the government had its way, the Nosferatu gang would be gone. Whoever they were working for or with would also be exposed and then disposed of. Jessica seemed to believe this was the perfect solution that would solve all the city's problems. "That sounds like a mess," Ruth said honestly, shaking her head at Jessica's impassioned, patriotic speech. Jessica paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Excuse me." Ruth realized she had probably just struck a nerve, but her mind was too tired to stop her. Some random people coming in, starting a war with a huge city-spanning gang, along with their mysterious partners. It sounds like it'll destroy the city. Not to mention what'll happen after they're done. Will the government forces just pack up and leave? A new gang will be poised and ready to jump in and fill the gap in a heartbeat. They might even be worse than the Nosferatu. Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "That won't happen. I'm sure there's a plan in place for protecting the civilians and dealing with the aftermath." Ruth revisited her earlier judgment that Jessica was very smart. "Do you really believe that?" She gestured around at the tight, hidden space the group was sitting in. "Then why haven't they taken care of people like us until now? Why haven't they done anything to actually help regular people?" "Oh, of course I do." Jessica seemed a bit distraught, as if she couldn't believe Ruth was really asking her this. Ruth interrupted. "Look, Jessica, I know you want to help people. I bet your dad wants to help people too. But to me, it sounds like the government or whoever just cares about taking out a problem. They don't care about us." Jessica looked like she wanted to object, but stopped cold as she glanced around the tiny living space. The pile of dirty and ragged clothes, the nearly expired canned food, the handful of crummy blankets. They were the only things Ruth and Ezra owned, and they weren't ever likely to get more than this. Ezra kicked his sister's foot, shooting Ruth a glare as Jessica seemed to retreat into herself. Ruth sighed, feeling like a bad guy suddenly. "I didn't mean to hurt your feelings or anything. Honestly, I shouldn't have said anything at all. I just got a bit frustrated. I'm sorry." Ruth wasn't normally one to apologize, but Jessica had earned at least that much from her. There was an awkward silence as the apology hung in the air. Ezra kept glancing between Ruth and Jessica, a searching expression on his face. He seemed to sense something between the 2 girls and raised an eyebrow toward Ruth, who ignored him. Eventually, Jessica spoke up. "Thank you for the apology." Another pause, then she spoke again. "I know that things won't be good. I just want to help people. My dad says we're heroes, bravely facing danger to help get rid of the bad guys of the world. And I do think that's important. Really important. But I know some people get caught in the line of fire." Ruth let the silence hang for a moment before coming to a realization. "Is that why you offered us a way out of the city? A chance to come with you?" Jessica nodded. The action seemed weak and half-hearted. "I've never interacted with homeless kids before. Seeing someone my age, having to do what you guys do just to survive. I wanted to help." She sounded pathetic, her pitiable sadness like a weight on her shoulders. Ruth hesitantly reached out, laying a hand on Jessica's shoulder. It felt totally natural, touching another person willingly that wasn't her brother. If you can get us out of this city, it will help. You'll literally save our lives." The words seemed to resonate with something in Jessica, and she looked up into Ruth's eyes. She laid her own hand over Ruth's, much to Ruth's embarrassment, and nodded firmly. "I will save you two, I promise it." Ruth locked eyes with Jessica, an unspoken connection building between them, dependency, trust, and something else. Ezra spoke then, causing both girls to suddenly flinch back as if they had done something wrong. "So can I tell you guys what I found out?" Jessica cleared her throat awkwardly before focusing her attention on Ezra. "Go ahead, please." Ezra started explaining, beginning when he split up from Ruth. "Well, I ran back to the church, but Johnny wasn't there. I think all the Dampiers had been given jobs by that point." Ruth nodded. Sometimes people got orders quickly, and sometimes it took a while. They had gotten lucky. Unlucky, it was hard to say. "So I decided to run to the drop-off point. It was a ways away, but I didn't know how else to get a hold of someone from the gang. When I got there, Richard was meeting with some guy I'd never seen before." "What did he look like?" Jessica asked. "He was short and fat, brown hair with big sideburns. Could have been a vampire. I think there was a guy like that named Reginald or something. Well, anyway, he and Richard were having this big discussion when I came in. Richard seemed really nervous, and when he saw me, he started freaking out. He rushed over, shaking me and asking me where Jessica was. Jessica frowned at that, but didn't interrupt as Ezra continued. So I told him you got grabbed by some constables. He looked pissed off, and I thought he was going to hit me. But the other guy, the fat one, came over and asked me to go look for you two. Richard and Johnny towed me out of there and made me lead them toward where you got grabbed. We stopped at some other places along the way, picking up and bringing along some other ghouls. So the ghouls all know where the other ones are waiting for battery pickups. That was interesting information. It meant that they likely received those spots from higher up the chain. Ruth had always assumed that ghouls just had their own little hidden lairs, picking one at random whenever they hired siphoners. We got back to the area where I saw you guys last, and we noticed a constable car rushing past. Its lights were flashing and its horn was blaring. Some of the ghouls didn't want to get closer, but Richard made us chase after it. We followed it to a crime scene, and there were people everywhere. I saw the constables who had taken Jessica. They were all beaten up. But there was also a dead constable. He got shot by a flash gun right in his face. People were crowding around and freaking out. Ruth shivered. Getting shot by a flash gun had always seemed like an awful way to go. Most of the time, it only burned and made a person writhe on the ground in pain. But if a shot hit your head, it could cook your brain right up. Ruth had seen that happen once. A ghoul had been caught with full batteries after getting a siphoner drop-off. The constables had just taken him out, right there in an alley. Ruth had made sure Ezra hadn't watched, but she sometimes had nightmares about it. "You guys weren't there, obviously, so I assumed you escaped somehow. I told Richard that, and he made us go all the way back to the church. I was starting to get a bit nervous now because Richard was getting really jumpy and weird. So I asked him if I could leave. Richard just laughed, and he sounded kind of crazy. He kept muttering and biting his nails, but I couldn't really tell what he was saying. When I started to struggle a bit, he pulled a flash gun on me and told me to shut up and follow orders." Ruth made a silent promise in her heart to push Richard off the top of the power plant. "He made the other ghouls hide around the church area. Then we waited a while. You said you guys saw us, but we never saw you. Richard just got more and more nervous as time passed. Eventually, the fat guy showed up and told all the ghouls to disperse. He made Richard follow him further in the city, dragging me along with him. The closer we got to the power plant, the more freaked out Richard got. He kept glancing backward, and I thought he was going to try and run. But eventually, we got to an office building near the plant, and it was full of gang members and power banks and stuff. That would be my dad's office, I bet. Was there a painting of a wilted sunflower in the lobby, big, with a blue background?" Ezra thought for a second, squeezing his face in concentration. "Yeah, I think so." Jessica nodded. "That's it then. Each of the thralls gets their own offices with weird decor. My dad got a sunflower motif. I bet they searched the whole place top to bottom." Ruth had no idea what a motif was, but before she could ask, Ezra kept talking. "It was really messy, so probably. Anyway, they asked me a whole bunch of questions and stuff. I lied to them about where we lived. Ezra looked at Ruth and grinned. I told them we still lived in that shed near the edge of town. That was a good lie. Ruth had left a few things stashed there in case they ever needed emergency clothes or a place to lay low. If the gang searched it, they would find things that indicated Ruth and Ezra stayed there. Good thinking. Ruth rubbed Ezra's head, and he beamed. So they sent some guys to go check it out. But before they came back, the fat guy got a message and had to leave. He brought me with him, and we left Richard back out the house. We ended up going to the power plant, but I tried to run away before we went in. I didn't see any flash guns, so I tried to shake the fat guy off. He let me go, and I booked it. But I only made it a few feet before some lady landed in front of me. Landed? Ruth asked. Yeah. I didn't see where she jumped from, but she crashed down in front of me, just out of nowhere. It was really scary. Before I could run away, she backhanded me across the face. Ezra touched his black eye gingerly. It looked painful, and Ruth silently added another victim to her growing hit list. Well, I fell down, and the lady picked me up with one hand. She just grabbed my shirt and pulled me up. She was pretty skinny too, so I was really surprised. It was crazy. She said something to the fat guy, but my face hurt too much, so I'm not sure what it was. She just kept holding me up for a minute, and they kept glaring at each other. After a bit, he just turned and kept walking. The lady held me under her arm and carried me to the power plant. But a weird thing happened just before we got inside. Weirder than everything that's happened so far, Ruth muttered to herself. Ezra nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. The lady whispered something to me when no one was looking. She told me that I should give my sister a message when I saw you again. Ruth tensed slightly, a phantom chill washing over her. What was the message? Next time, come and walk with me in the light of God. Jessica turned to Ruth, curious. Does that mean anything to you? Nothing Ruth could think of made the sentence sound not crazy. Unless, what was she wearing? Both Ezra and Jessica looked at her with confused expressions. I think it was just a shirt and pants. Come to think of it, she was dressed pretty lightly. Lots of exposed skin. Why? A stronger chill rushed over Ruth, and she felt a shudder wash over her. Oh, that might be kinda crazy, actually. What? Both Ezra and Jessica asked simultaneously. I'm pretty sure that lady can be out in the sunlight. I think I saw her earlier today on top of the power plant. Chapter 12. A person who can walk in the sun, in this city. That's impossible. Jessica protested. She was right, it was impossible. A person couldn't just walk out in the daytime, especially in the open like the person Ruth had seen. But all signs pointed to the fact that this woman had done exactly that. I thought I was hallucinating her or something. I saw someone at the top of the plant when we were escaping down the city ceiling. Ezra looked hurt. You didn't tell me that. Ruth gave him a defeated shrug. I thought it was heat stroke or something. I didn't want to worry you. Jessica was still loudly protesting. No, seriously, there's been so much research into protecting humans from intense solar exposure. No one has ever even come close to letting someone walk outside in areas with daytime constellations for any extended period of time. Even with intense protective covering, a person could only last about an hour or so. Was she covered? Ruth shook her head. Not that I could tell, just looked like she was wearing basic clothes to me. Jessica turned to Ezra. Was she tanned or anything? No, she was super pale, like us. Well, there you go. Even if someone could go out in the sun unprotected, they would still get tanned or sunburned at a minimum. Jessica nodded in satisfaction, as if her point had been proved. Ruth didn't know anything about science or stuff like that. But she had seen someone out in the sun, and someone had apparently seen her too. Jessica seemed unconvinced, so she let the matter drop, not wanting to get into a fight about it. Well, what happened after she brought you inside? She brought me into the building, and there were a bunch of people there. They all glared at the lady, but the fat guy yelled at them. They took me to a room, and some scary-looking guys came in. The one who was holding me when you rescued me was there, and he started asking me some questions again. I told them all the same stuff, and they mostly left me alone after that. Then things got really weird. A whole bunch of random people came in and started talking with each other. I recognized one guy. the head priest who sometimes visits the church where the soup kitchen is. I've seen him at other churches too. Ruth frowned. The head priest. That old guy with the long white hair who looks older than anyone we've ever seen. Yeah. He came in with a bunch of other people. Some of them looked like priests, but some others were dressed really light, like the woman who hit me. It was really tense, with everyone standing pretty far apart from each other. Then this chubby woman walked in like she owned the place. She was kinda tall, and she was wearing a really ugly dress with a pattern that made my eyes hurt. She started talking to everyone at the same time and was acting super bossy, which annoyed some people. There was a bit of fighting between the groups, and then a bunch of people left. I was still in the room, and the guy you saved me from grabbed me and pulled me toward the other groups. Some more people walked in. I think they were gang members, and they all started talking about Jessica and her dad. Then they started talking to me. The priest was nice, but the chubby lady was really scary. She kept offering me candy like a creep. I told them the same stuff a third time, and they decided to ignore me after that. Ruth was having a hard time following this, but Jessica was nodding along like this all made sense. So there were 3 or so groups, the gang, the church, and another group, possibly related to the plant. We only heard part of the conversation before we rescued you. What was it about? Jessica seemed intense and focused. Clearly this was all deeply related to her father's mission, but Ruth wasn't sure she wanted to know any of this stuff, not if it made their lives even more dangerous. Something about how their plans had been discovered. They all seemed a bit worried and kept saying they'd have to hurry. The priest kept talking about syrup. Do you mean seraphs? Ruth had remembered the odd word, guessing that the old-sounding voice probably belonged to the much older head priest. Yeah, that. He said they only had 20 of them, I think. It seemed like they were really important. Do you know what those are, Jess? Jessica looked thoughtful. I think they're angels. Something like messengers of God. She shrugged after a moment. I haven't been to church in a while. Weird. Maybe it's a code word? Ruth couldn't imagine how the church could have 20 angels hanging around. Ruth was pretty sure they didn't exist anyway. And even if they did, what kind of angels would hang around a city like this? Ezra shrugged. They didn't talk about any specific plans a lot, just that they needed to start doing stuff right away. I think your dad really messed up whatever they were doing, Jess. Jessica nodded, seeming satisfied. Good. They deserved to have their evil plans ruined. Ruth wasn't so sure that was the right message to take away from this. Are they ruined? It sounds like they're still going to do whatever they were planning, just sooner rather than later. We don't know that anything has been messed up. Jessica got quiet after that, and Ruth felt compelled to say something to cheer her up. Well, at least your dad is okay. We'll go meet back up with him first thing in the morning. Jessica smiled. Yeah, we should probably get some sleep though. We'll head to the safe house bright and early. Ezra needed no further encouragement, quickly lying down in his corner and getting comfortable. Ruth suddenly felt very awkward as she realized they hadn't considered the sleeping situation. She eyed both her blanket and the pile of clothes, silently weighing her options. Do you want my blanket? I don't mind sleeping on the clothes pile. No, I couldn't possibly take your bed, blanket. No, it's fine, please. No, you. No, you. Rock, paper, scissors. Done. A short game later, Ruth used her winner's privilege to insist that Jessica take the blanket, the other girl begrudgingly accepting. Ezra had already passed out, clearly exhausted from the effort of the day. He snored softly as both girls got comfortable in their spots. Ruth felt herself sink into the clothing pile and found it strangely comfortable. It smelled a bit, but letting her body just relax against the fabric helped her calm down. She had a faint memory of a mattress from her childhood, feeling this comfortable. Glancing over at Jessica, Ruth felt her mind begin to wander over the events of the day and thought about the other girl's place in them. Dragged into a crazy mess that had almost cost her everything, she should hate Jessica. But instead, Ruth found herself appreciating the girl more and more. Jessica had been nothing but helpful in the face of constant danger. She had quickly become a reliable partner and someone who Ruth had quickly come to trust. It pissed her off so much. Ruth felt anger surge, mostly at herself. She had taken the bait of money, and she had stayed because Jessica was, well, she was. Ruth quickly decided to abandon that train of thought before she admitted things to herself that she didn't want to hear. Instead, she angrily threw a shirt over her head, blotting out the soft light that shone from their lamp. Instead, she thought about taking her brother out of this god-forsaken city, trying to relax again. Her mind pictured a life somewhere else, somewhere safe, where her brother could go to school and build a life for himself. A life where Ruth could earn money safely, doing something that would let her enjoy her life instead of struggling each and every day. But as she let her mind begin to drift, a soft voice pulled her back to reality. "Ruth, are you asleep?" Ruth lifted the shirt off of her head and opened an eye to look at Jessica. "Not yet. Did you need something? The bathroom is a floor down." Jessica propped herself up and shook her head. "No, I just wanted to say something, if that's okay." Ruth raised an eyebrow, sitting up to give Jessica her full attention. "I'm sorry for all this. I thought the best way to get a message to the outside would be a trip to the ceiling panels. I knew about siphoners, and I asked my dad to set me up with the best ones. I thought it would be fine." Jessica was silent for a long moment. "I never really thought about it, you know? I mean, really thought about it. When I saw that you were my age, when I saw that Ezra was so young, it broke my heart a bit." Silence stretched between them. Ruth wasn't really sure what to say. You. The two girls both spoke in the same moment, pausing at the unexpected interruption. "You go first," Ruth said. Jessica seemed to want to object, but Ruth simply made the starting gesture to rock, paper, scissors again. They both let out a small laugh, and Jessica smiled softly. "I decided I wanted to take you guys with me, out of the city, I mean. It wasn't part of the plan, and I didn't talk to my dad about it beforehand, but I felt guilty for taking advantage of you two like that, you know? You don't need to make us feel guilty for having us do something we were going to do anyway. My brother and I are siphoners. We do it to survive, not because anyone makes us. Dragging us into your mess sucked, but you didn't know all that stuff was going to happen." Ruth paused, looking at Jessica. The other girl was still sulking, despite Ruth's attempt to cheer her up. "Besides, you helped me get Ezra back. That's the most redeeming thing you could have done." Jessica seemed unsure, but she met Ruth's eyes anyway. "No hard feelings?" she asked tentatively. Ruth gave a soft smile, then reached out for a handshake. "No hard feelings." They shook on it. But before Jessica could let go, Ruth's grip tightened. Ruth looked into the other girl's eyes, her voice growing serious. "But you are going to get us out of this city, right?" Jessica gripped just as tightly, her own eyes burning with fierce determination. "I will. I promise." Ruth slowly relaxed her grip, her gut once more telling her to trust Jessica. But Ruth didn't remove her hand, not wanting the moment of contact to end, but knowing full well that she should pull away. "This whole thing is really scary. I always thought the worst thing that could happen to me was that me and Ezra would get pressed into the Nosferatu gang. That we would become the next generation of ghouls or something." Jessica chuckled softly, her voice full of sarcasm. "Yeah, it would suck to be a part of them." Ruth let out a laugh, joining in on the fun. "Oh, for sure, I heard they have a girl my age who's a total airhead." Jessica pretended to be offended, lightly slapping Ruth's arm. "How dare you? I'll have you know that my acting saved me more times than I can count." Ruth playfully hit back. "You sure it was an act? Maybe you're just pretending to be smart and capable. I bet the real you is a ditz who likes shopping more than spying." Jessica let out a gasp of indignation, her eyes sparkling mischievously. "A ditz? You take that back." Ruth chuckled, shrugging and giving a wry smirk. "I only speak the truth, your ditziness." Jessica glanced around for something to throw at Ruth before both girls began giggling furiously. Ezra stirred slightly in his sleep, and Ruth quickly quieted, not wanting to wake her brother after the day he'd had. Jessica laid back down, her own mood mellowing out as well. "You know, I haven't been shopping for fun since I came to this city. I kind of miss it." Ruth couldn't really relate, but she was curious about what made the other girl tick. "Why not?" "I chose to hide my real self from the gang, pretending to be a ditz. And because I always had to go out with escorts, I could never buy the things I actually wanted. And my father was always too busy to take me himself, so I just stopped going. Sounds tough, Ruth said honestly. Not being able to do the things you wanted to do sucked, though Ruth had grown used to it a long time ago. It's nothing like what you've gone through. I really shouldn't complain. Nah, when life sucks, it sucks. I'd rather be sad in a mansion, but at least I don't have to worry about a gang finding out my secret identity as a ditz. This time, Jessica did throw something at Ruth, and both girls giggled again as the blanket smacked Ruth in the face. Silence fell between them again, but it felt different this time. Ruth was oddly comfortable, the empty air feeling right instead of wrong. The conversation had been nice, positive even. Ruth's confidence rose slightly as she thought about how easily they had talked, and she found her mouth moving before she could stop herself. Maybe when we leave the city, you can take me shopping sometime. I'll probably need nice clothes instead of… She picked at the pile of dirty, threadbare laundry beneath her. Instead of what we've got now. There was a pause, and Ruth's heart sank into her feet at the prolonged silence. She had messed it up. She had ruined the good mood. Her life was over. This had been her single worst mistake of her. Okay, that actually sounds pretty fun. Jessica took a breath, then said the three most confusing, beautiful words Ruth had ever heard. It's a date. Ruth froze. She should have been relieved that Jessica hadn't rejected her offer, but all she could feel was a sense of disconnection. Had Jessica just said date? Homeless orphans didn't do dates. Homeless orphans got kicked out of her way by people who were actually on dates. Ruth wanted to say something, clarify what Jessica had actually meant. But she couldn't. What if she had misunderstood or was reading into it too much? What if it had been innocent slang, and by asking, Ruth would make the other girl uncomfortable? Gah, why does my brain get this way? Ruth wondered in her mind. Jessica was doing something to her she didn't understand, and every new interaction took her on crazy twists and turns that just left her confused. Ruth was a siphoner, and a dang good one. She was tough and cool and clever. Some random girl that she had only met today would not ruin that hard-built image. Ruth would ask. She could do this. It was only a single question. Nothing could be simpler. She would make sure Jessica meant what she said and had really wanted a date. Ruth sat up, feeling brave and focused. She opened her mouth to speak when Jessica said something to interrupt her. Good night, Ruth. I'll see you in the morning. Jessica then laid down and closed her eyes. Ruth deflated in an instant, the conversation clearly over. She shut her mouth and laid back down. Silently, Ruth promised herself that she could just ask in the morning. She would be tough and cool and clever tomorrow. Chapter 13. Morning came, and Ruth chickened out. There was no mention of the conversation she had shared with Jessica last night, and Ruth could feel a bubbling, nervous energy as the group ate breakfast. She wanted to talk, but now wasn't the time. Ezra was all business this morning, quickly diving into their plans as he ate. Okay, we have about half an hour before the work crews show up, so we have to leave soon. I think I have a route to the safe house, based on where Jessica told me it is. Actually, I was hoping we could make a stop somewhere else first. Jessica looked a bit guilty about ruining Ezra's plans so quickly. It better not be about getting that data from your dad's office, Ruth warned. That place will probably still be crawling with ghouls. Jessica quickly shook her head. No, actually, I wanted to know where you stashed the siphoning kit, Ruth. The kit? What for? Remember when my father said I sent a signal out? The reason I came siphoning with you guys? Ruth and Ezra both nodded. I had a tiny radio transmitter with me. The ceiling panels of the city block all but the strongest radio signals, so I had to get out on the roofs for long enough to send a signal. I stashed the radio in the pack with the battery when you guys weren't looking. Do you still need it? Ezra asked. Ruth could tell he was mentally mapping out their route, his finger tracing possible ways to the gear on the floor. Yeah, probably. Knowing that the church is involved in this, along with a third group associated with the power plant, means I should inform the GOA just in case. They need to know what's going on. If it'll get them here quicker to deal with this mess, I'm fine with it, Ruth said around a mouthful of canned bread. I don't remember exactly where the pack is, but I can get us to the general area. Hopefully, it's still there. Things left on rooftops were usually safe, but there were no guarantees beyond a few hours. If they were left for too long, some homeless person would find and take it, no matter what it was. Ruth herself had stolen things left lying around from time to time, usually to sell them and make a quick buck. A full power bank and solar panel would be worth a lot more than a quick buck to the right buyer. Good enough for me. If we can find it, great. If not, my dad can figure out something else. The group finished eating, gave themselves a few minutes to clean up and get ready, then headed out. They didn't bring anything from the hideout with them, not wanting to seem conspicuous. The only thing any of them carried was the flash gun, carefully stored in the waistband of Jessica's clothes. They left just before the first work crew arrived, and Ruth silently hoped she would never have to come back here ever again. Soon they would be out of the city, living with a nice reward in whatever house Jessica could set up for them. Ruth didn't really care about any of the ratty clothes, dirty blankets, or canned food they were leaving behind. Ruth began leading them across rooftops, looking for familiar sights to get her bearings. Chasing after Jessica and the constables yesterday had felt hectic and wild, even if it had ended up being one of the calmer parts of her day in the end. The problem Ruth was running into was that she could lead them to their initial siphoning spot, but she wasn't sure how far down she and Ezra had gone down the ceiling panels. Her mental map of that area was a bit hazy around the edges. Her state of mind at the time had been too worked up to pay careful attention. She ended up getting help from Ezra, who pointed out where the crime scene had been. Once Ruth saw where the roped-off area was, she was able to work her way backwards to where she had stashed the bags until eventually found it. The bags were right where she had left them, placed inconspicuously against the side of a roof. She opened the packs and noted with relief that everything seemed to be there. Jessica jogged over, rummaging through the pack with the battery before pulling out a tiny device. Like most devices Ruth had seen, the tiny machine had a spot for an external battery. However, there was also a tiny solar panel on it, which folded against its side when not in use. The whole contraption was only as big as Ruth's palm, and she peered at it suspiciously. It didn't look that impressive to her. That thing can broadcast to other cities. How does it even work? Jessica pointed to a small part of the device which looked like it was made of mesh. You can record a message, then set the device to transmit on repeat. My father recorded what little we knew, and I began transmitting it when we got out to the edge. She examined the device, then cursed softly. I must have left it on yesterday, and now the battery is dead. We'll have to charge it back up, record a new message, then set it and transmit it. Ruth pulled out the battery pack, still humming with a small amount of energy. Can we use this? It'll help, but I really want a full charge if we can get it. The radio has a little solar panel on it, and it won't use power when it's in the sun. But once the shade hits it, it'll only transmit until the battery dies. It would probably be better to charge them separately, then connect the battery to the radio. Ezra took the radio, turning it over in his hands. Do we need it to keep transmitting? Once we get the message out, it should be fine, right? Jessica shook her head, grimacing. We overheard the Nosferatu gang talking about how they intercepted a transmission, and it got me worried. The longer I can leave it running, the better chance we should have of the message getting to the right people. Ruth hefted the pack with the solar panel in it, the clothes stored inside cushioning it against her back. Well, I don't want to do it here. There's a chance that a patrol will come check this spot again. Let's find a better place to set up, then we can get charging right away. They moved off, and Ruth led them away from any of the spots she had used in the past few months. She didn't want to take them too close to the safe house, but she knew that timing could be vital here. Not taking too long to get to a charging spot was important, but there was a chance they would want to rush back to Jessica's dad when they were done. So Ruth angled them in the right direction, keeping an eye out for an easy access point to the city ceiling. Ruth ended up choosing a spot low in the city, much lower than she would normally pick for charging, given how late in the day she usually got started. But given how early it was, they wouldn't have to worry about the shadows blocking the light too much. She started to get dressed in the extra clothing, Jessica joining her. Ezra, keep watch again, okay? If there's trouble, we'll figure it out. A repeat of yesterday would be a disaster, but Ruth knew that Jessica could probably keep up with them if they decided to run. Ezra nodded, but his attention seemed divided. He kept glancing around at their surroundings, frowning to himself. Ezra! Ruth snapped her fingers in front of his face, and he flinched, straightening up. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm sorry." He seemed a bit dejected at the scolding, and Ruth could tell he really meant it. He was normally very reliable, and now wasn't the time to nitpick. "It's all right. Just stay focused, yeah?" Ezra nodded, his gaze sharpening as he straightened up. He wouldn't make a mistake again. Ruth was confident of that. Ruth and Jessica climbed up to the ceiling panel, covered head to toe in cloth. Ezra passed up the portable charging panel and battery, and they slowly moved toward the edge of the shade. Once they made it to the edge, Ruth's practiced hands set up the solar panel with ease. It began charging the battery pack, which would take about 2 hours to fully charge. Jessica took the little radio, extended its tiny solar panel, and placed it out in the sunlight. The bottom of the device gripped to the ceiling panel like it was made of rubber, which meant the device wouldn't slide down the sloped panels. It should reach full power in about 20 minutes. I'll record the message, then set it transmit. Once the sun goes down, the battery will keep it broadcasting. Ruth had chosen a spot that would get sunlight for most of the day, on the south side of the city. Assuming this worked, the radio would keep transmitting into the night, possibly even into the morning, depending on how much power it drew from the battery. They would leave all the gear here. Ruth knew that it wouldn't really help them after this, though part of her was loath to leave something so valuable lying around. Jessica's flash gun had almost a full charge, and she said the safe house had extra batteries for it, so they wouldn't bother charging it as well. There was no reason to lug the incriminating equipment around anymore. It would only cause trouble if they kept it. The two girls sat in silence, and Ruth looked out at the small line of horizon she could see. She marveled that she had seen the entire sky yesterday, if only for a moment. She had seen something almost nobody in the city would ever be able to witness. And yet, soon she would be somewhere that didn't need to be protected from the sun. She would be able to walk under the blue sky as much as she wanted. Ruth found herself wanting that desperately, her desire to escape this city, to give her brother a better life. It felt like a visceral need, a burning thing that needed to escape and get free. A chance at a real life, it was so close that she could almost reach out and touch it. The thoughts whirled in her mind like the winds that had battered them in the power plant's canyon last night, battering her brain relentlessly. Everything that was happening terrified her. But there was an escape. She would take the escape. She would take it. Jessica moved next to her, and Ruth flinched slightly as her brain flung the world back into focus. But the other girl was only reaching out for the radio. "Okay, it's fully charged." Ruth had been so overwhelmed by her desires that she hadn't noticed how much time had passed. That was dangerous. She made herself concentrate on the moment, pushing all thoughts of escape into the back of her mind for now. "Do you know what you'll say?" Jessica nodded. "I think so, but if I mess up, I'll have to start all over. The sooner I get it right, the sooner we can leave." "You'll be fine. Just don't be too loud, okay?" Jessica nodded, took a deep breath, then began to speak. "This is Jessica Reynolds, daughter of Michael Reynolds of the GOA. Our cover has been blown, and we are requesting immediate pickup. The Nosferatu gang are working with local religious groups and at least part of the Helianthus Power Administration team. Their end goals remain unknown, but the scale of this operation seems to indicate a citywide emergency. Be cautioned, as we believe they intend to take control of the city's power supply. They may also have solar-resistant soldiers. I repeat, there is a possibility of solar-resistant soldiers. This message will repeat as long as possible." With a click, Jessica switched off the recording function of the device. She looked at Ruth and nodded in satisfaction. "That should do it." They quickly began setting up the radio again while running a power cable from the larger solar battery to the radio's much smaller one. The panel and charge pack would operate as an external, much larger source of power. Nearly all devices operated on a universal standard, and the illegal batteries had ports of all sizes. Just before Jessica could switch it on and begin the transmission, Ezra climbed up to the ceiling panel the girls were sitting on and waved his arms to get their attention. "Ruth, Jessica!" he shouted at them, trying not to be too loud. Ruth turned back to him, growing nervous as she crawled up to meet him. "What is it?" "A patrol." "No, I noticed something, though. You need to come look at this." Ruth glanced back at Jessica, who waved her away to follow her brother. Ruth climbed down with Ezra, landing on the rooftop below. Ezra led her to the building's edge and pointed at something on a nearby building. Ruth had to take off her shaded goggles to accurately see what he was showing her. There was a long, thick banner hanging from a building across the street. It was a deep red color, with a black sunflower symbol design emblazoned on the middle. It was simple in design, but struck Ruth as incredibly ominous. She had never seen it before, and she turned to Ezra in confusion. "I don't get it. Why dash?" Ezra turned and silently pointed down the street. Ruth squinted as she looked in that direction, then noticed a similar banner hanging a block away. As she looked, she noticed that every block had at least one banner hanging from buildings, street signs, or walkways. They were all over the place, and Ruth felt a sense of dread wash over her. This couldn't be good. Ruth slowly backed away from the roof's edge, pulling Ezra with her. "Something is going on, and I don't like it at all. Come on, let's grab Jessica and get out of here." Ruth began climbing back up onto the ceiling panel above her. "Jessica, something is wrong. We need to—" Ruth suddenly stopped in her tracks, halfway onto the ceiling panel. Jessica was no longer sitting on the edge of the shade. Instead, she was pinned to the ground by someone. A single hand had reached under the gap in the ceiling panels and held Jessica face down against the blue surface. The person holding her squeezed under the arched panel above them, still holding Jessica down with a single hand. She was a blonde-haired, pale-skinned woman with intense green eyes. She wore a simple shirt and simple pants, her skin prominently on display. The woman had walked out of open sunlight without a care in the world. She spoke, a wild grin spreading across her face. "I think your warning came just a bit too late." Chapter 14. Ruth didn't know what to do. Her body was only halfway up on the ceiling panel, which meant any movement to climb up or drop down wouldn't be that quick. The woman who had been standing in the sun didn't appear to have any weapons on her, but that didn't make her any less dangerous. If she could withstand the burning heat of day, there was no telling what else she could do. Anything Ruth did could result in Jessica getting seriously hurt. The woman was still grinning at Ruth, and she called out again. "I assume Ezra is down there too. Can you tell him I still feel bad about how hard I hit him?" Ruth bristled but didn't do anything. This was the same person Ezra had talked about last night, the one who had hit him in the face when he had tried to run. It was also the same person Ruth had seen at the top of the power plant yesterday. Glancing at Jessica, Ruth could see that she was struggling against the woman's grip on her clothing. The fact that Jessica couldn't even budge the woman indicated a lot about how strong this lady was. This was a very bad situation. Jessica was caught, and Ruth didn't know if she had managed to turn the radio on or not. Ruth made a stay gesture at Ezra below the lip of the ceiling panel, then slowly climbed up, keeping her eye on the woman the whole time. The woman just kept grinning like a fool as Ruth slowly approached her, seeming completely unconcerned with any threat Ruth might represent. Ruth stopped about 10 feet away from the edge of the shade, not daring to get any closer. "Ezra said you wanted to meet me." The woman nodded, still grinning. "I did. It's not every day I meet another daywalker, especially one who hasn't received God's blessing." That sentence was full of things Ruth didn't understand. She also didn't really care right now. It wasn't important until she helped Jessica. "Can you let her go, please?" Ruth gestured at the still struggling Jessica, still being held down by a single hand. The woman obliged, releasing Jessica, who quickly began scrambling up the inclined panel. Ruth wanted to ask her about the radio, but couldn't think of a way to do it discreetly right now. She had to distract this woman somehow so that they could run away. But before she could think of something to say, the woman initiated more conversation. "The name's Saha." The woman kept her eyes glued to Ruth's. It was getting more than a little creepy now, with how much grinning and eye contact was going on. "You're Ruth, right? And the girl I let go is Jessica?" Ruth ignored the question, deciding to try her luck digging for info instead. "How did you find us?" "Luck mostly," the woman shrugged non-committally. "I was just minding my own business, then noticed a siphoner's kit poking out from under a panel. I came to investigate and found you three." Saha's crazy grin returned. "God has truly blessed me this day." The woman didn't seem like the religious type to Ruth, and her references to God felt strange, even ignoring how crazy they made her sound. She was young, probably in her 20s, and she carried herself like a thug, sauntering and full of confidence. That was usually more the type you saw in a gang, not a churchgoer. "You called me a daywalker?" Saha nodded eagerly. "Of course. You ventured out into the sun of your own accord. You bathed in the holy light and lived to tell the tale." I was very impressed. Ruth didn't know what to make of that, so she ignored it for the moment. "So you were the person I saw on top of the plant?" Saha took a bow, throwing her entire body into the over-the-top action. "That was me. My first day out, and I saw a new friend right away." This woman seemed more deranged with every sentence that escaped her lips. "First day? New friend?" Saha opened her mouth to speak, but a sudden crackling noise sounded through the air. Ruth and Jessica whipped their heads around, their tense nerves spiking at the sudden sound. Saha, on the other hand, blinked in surprise before grinning wildly once more. "Already time?" Just before the message began playing, Ruth realized that the crackle she had heard was an intercom system. But there shouldn't be any speakers in this part of town. There was no need for them. A woman's voice sounded over the speakers, which Ruth still couldn't see. "Attention, citizens of Helianthus. My name is Barbara Lumen, the owner and operator of the Helianthus power plant. This message is being broadcast citywide to inform you of a wonderful development. The city of Helianthus has just submitted its notice of independence to the rest of the civilized world. From now on, the city-state of Helianthus will be self-regulated and self-contained." Jessica's jaw dropped, and Ruth could only stand there in total disbelief at what she was hearing. What the hell was this? The message continued, "Please understand that this will be a trying time. There are those who wish to prevent this change from occurring. And as such, we, the new ruling government of Helianthus, are forced to make some hard choices. All travel to and from our new nation is temporarily banned. All communication with the outside world will be prevented. All efforts to resist new governmental procedures will be met with swift retribution. Aside from these changes, life will continue just as it was before. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation." Static crackled once more as the intercom system switched off. Ruth turned to face Saha, who was grinning like a fool. "Ain't it great? A whole new nation, a holy country where we can freely exist." Saha gestured back and forth between the two of them. "Us daywalkers will live like queens." Saha's grin was nearly manic now, her eyes unfocused. The woman looked completely crazy, her voice full of powerful emotions. Ruth just stared at the woman, her mouth moving but not letting any sound come out. Jessica was not as slow to react. With a quick motion, Jessica drew her flash gun and fired at Saha. The beam of light that emanated from the weapon flared in Ruth's eyes, and she had to squint as she began to backpedal. Jessica took the chance to start to run, and Ruth knew she had to follow. She had more questions, but Jessica's quick shot was probably their best chance to run. Ruth and Jessica didn't stop to see what had happened to Saha, instead sprinting for the edge of the ceiling panel and leaping off of it. They landed on the roof below, stumbling for a moment before running again. Ezra followed after them without a word, and the three sprinted toward the nearest rooftop, eager to get away. Ruth didn't hear any sounds of pursuit and risked a glance over her shoulder. Saha was standing on the edge of the panel they had just left, not a mark on her. Either Jessica had missed, or Saha was unharmed by the beam of burning light. Saha didn't move to chase, instead giving Ruth a predatory smile and waving goodbye like she was seeing off an old friend. Ruth ripped her gaze away from the woman and ran even harder. Only when they were blocks away and on ground level did the group stop to catch their breath. Ruth and Jessica had shed some of their clothes while they ran, but were still mostly covered from head to toe. They huddled in an alley, watching and listening carefully for several minutes as they checked for any sign of pursuit. When they felt safe enough, they began talking in hushed tones as Ruth and Jessica began rapidly removing their extra layers. "I think we're clear. Now what the hell was all that about?" Ruth hissed. "What happened?" Ezra asked. "I don't know," Jessica said to Ruth. "My dad had no idea that things were this bad. Independence. That is bad, right?" "Of course it is," Jessica hissed angrily. "A group of criminals just took over a massive city that provides power to dozens of other cities. They basically declared war and are using the people who live here hostage. But how can they do that? Ezra asked. Won't the police or army come fight them? Jessica shook her head. The police are corrupt, owned by either the Nosferatu gang or the power plant. Now that they're working together, pretty much all the cops are on their side. As for the army, that would be really bad. What do you mean? Ezra asked nervously. The army doesn't know who all the targets are. They would basically have to take out the whole city just to be sure they got all the ringleaders. The whole point of my father going undercover was so that we could try to stealthily take out the leaders before the situation got worse. Ezra paled, but Ruth had a sudden thought. But doesn't Ezra know who all the ringleaders are? He saw them all last night, didn't he? Both girls looked at Ezra, who shrunk back slightly. He looked a bit nervous. I saw them all, but I don't know most of them. Though the lady who talked on the intercom was the same one from the meeting, I think. Her voice sounded the same. Jessica nodded. Well, it's something at least. We can add Barbara Lumen to the list of targets. Not that it really helps us right now. But can't we escape and tell the army who's in charge or whatever? Ruth didn't especially care about saving this horrid city, but if the people who had threatened and hurt her brother could be brought low by armed forces, that sounded good to her. Besides, there would probably be a reward of some kind. Jessica grimaced. I'm not sure. The original escape plan involved a fancy train car that we would take in secret. Now that travel is banned in and out of the city, that won't work. Fortunately, my message was able to be broadcast a few times before that Sahar lady showed up. That, combined with the notice of independence that I assume was sent out this morning, means the GOA will probably try to extract us a different way. Though I would have to talk to my father to be sure, this didn't paint a pretty picture. Not only were they wanted, but now they were also trapped in the city. Ruth cursed softly. So now what? Just go back to your dad and twiddle our thumbs while we wait for rescue. Jessica looked frustrated, but she nodded. There's no way we can sneak back for my dad's data now, so for now, yes. At least until we make a new plan. So what about the lady, Sahar? Ezra looked back and forth between the two girls. Why did she let us escape? Jessica patted her flash gun, tucked into her waistband once again. I got her good with this. She was probably in too much pain to chase. Actually, Ruth explained the circumstances of their escape, and Jessica glanced around nervously. What was her whole deal? She seemed insane to me, Jessica said, her hand gripping the flash pistol tightly. I don't know. She was super religious, and also obsessed with me or something. Ruth shuddered uncomfortably. I really hope we never run into her again. I'm worried she'd drag me out in the sun with her. Oh, and there are a bunch of other people like her, Ezra said. Ruth and Jessica both turned to stare at him. What? Well, she's one of those seraph things, right? And the head priest said they had about 20 of them. So there are probably 19 other people who can walk out in the sun. That was a scary thought. The woman had seemed unnaturally strong in addition to her immunity to the harsh sunlight. But was that just how she was? Or was there something more to these seraphs that they didn't understand? That's another thing. Daylight walkers could do a lot of harm to an incoming force, especially if the army doesn't know about them ahead of time. Day raids, possible immunity to flash guns, and who knows what else they have up their sleeves. Jessica mulled over the problem out loud, seeming more and more determined to try and do anything she could to stop them. Ruth placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll do something, I promise. But for now, your dad is probably going crazy wondering where we are. Let's go meet up with him. Then we can figure out the next move. Jessica hesitated but sighed and nodded. Okay, let's get going. The trek back to the safe house was nerve-wracking, to say the least. The group felt a bit paranoid about taking the roofs, concerned they might run into Sahar or another seraph while so close to the light. But the streets were growing more dangerous by the minute. People were marching up and down the roads and walkways, protesting or even rioting as constables and ghoul enforcers quickly moved in to subdue the unhappy populace. Several times, the group of three had to backtrack to avoid getting caught up in open displays of violence. What few windows existed in the city did not go untouched, and broken glass littered the streets. When the group finally made it to the safe house, they had to wait several long, agonizingly slow minutes for a group of protesters to march past so that they could cross the street unimpeded. The safe house looked surprisingly untouched by any rioters, but Ruth could tell Jessica was anxious about how long this was taking. When they were finally able to cross, Jessica practically sprinted to the door. She performed the coded knock, then waited. She did it again, then waited. She did it a third time, but apparently got impatient this time. She tried the door, and it swung open with ease. Jessica looked stunned for a moment, but rapidly shot into action. Jessica burst into the safe house, flash gun drawn and ready to blast. Ruth and Ezra quickly ducked inside, closing the door behind them and locking it. Michael had been in a chair in the living room when they had left, his stab wound keeping him down. But he wasn't there now, and Jessica whipped her head around, searching for him. The three quickly moved through the whole house, luckily finding no signs of disturbance or intrusion. But more importantly, they didn't find any sign of Michael either. Chapter 15. Ezra discovered a note from Michael situated just inside the front door. It had been swept into a corner when they burst in, and Jessica quickly took it from Ezra as he held it out. "Jessica, I thought of a lead I could follow. It's not far from here, so if you arrive at the safe house and I'm not here, I will return soon. Stay put once you arrive. I won't tell you where I'm going, because I know you'll try to follow me, or someone else may find this note and try to track me down. I'll see you soon. All my love." Jessica was clearly not pleased with the note. The instant she finished reading it, she threw it to the side and began storming around the room. Ezra read it, then tilted his head in confusion. "Didn't you guys say he got stabbed?" "Yes, he did," Jessica said angrily. "He should be here, on the chair, waiting for me to get back so I can go do his job for him." She began rummaging around the chair, picking up a magazine and leafing through it. Ruth looked worriedly at the other girl. What are you doing?" Jessica threw the magazine away with an angry huff. "I'm trying to see what triggered my father to come up with such a stupid idea. Something in here probably made him think of some place to go, and if I find it, I can try to follow him. So we aren't staying put. Your dad said we should stay here." Ruth gestured at the note. Jessica sighed, then looked over at Ruth. "I don't know. I might not find anything. But I'm not really interested in sitting around here either. For all we know, Father left this note last night and ran into trouble." Jessica kicked the recliner, but Ruth could tell it was more out of defeat than anger. It was a good point, and Ruth could sympathize with wanting to go after a family member. "Need some help looking around?" "No, why don't you and Ezra go make us some lunch? Use anything you want from the food stores and call me if you need help." The subtle rejection of her offer to help stung Ruth a bit, but she supposed she didn't really know anything about how Michael's brain worked. Ruth might pick up a clue and discard it, never knowing that she might have hindered Jessica's detective work. So Ruth and Ezra meandered into the kitchen while Jessica continued her hunt. A quick search of the pantry resulted in a large haul of non-perishables, but of a much nicer variety than Ruth usually purchased. She eyed a canned soup hungrily, her brother snatching up a jar of pickles for himself. They got to work opening things up when Ruth suddenly realized that she could actually heat up food here. Heated food had always been a luxury they could rarely afford outside of soup kitchens. Feeling confident, Ruth strolled over to the stove and placed the can of soup directly on top of the burner. What followed was a long process of trial and error, where Ruth inadvertently almost set the safe house on fire twice. Ezra eventually called for Jessica to come in, and the girl had to remove a boiling soup can from the stove with tongs and pour it into a pot. Ruth grinned sheepishly, and Jessica did her best to maintain a glare before breaking down into a laugh. The kitchen quickly became a mess as the group tore into the food and let themselves relax. No one was hunting them or threatening them, and as far as they knew, no one they cared about was in active danger. Ruth was relieved to see Jessica calm down a bit and equally relieved to be eating such good food. Lunch was a bit of a foreign concept to Ruth and Ezra, considering they were often out and about during the daytime hours. It felt like nearly too much food to be eating during the day, but years on the street had drilled the habit of filling her stomach whenever possible into her. She and Ezra wolfed down as much as possible, their stomachs groaning in protest. After they finished eating, Jessica began glancing at the front door worriedly every few minutes, and Ruth felt a strange need to distract her. Quickly glancing around, Ruth saw the small bulge of a weapon in Jessica's waistband. She decided to move the topic to Jessica's weapon, the flash pistol she had discharged earlier. "Oh, I guess I should replace the battery at this point. No sense in keeping less than a full charge if I don't need to." Jessica led them to the bedroom, where she climbed on the bed and removed a ceiling tile. She pulled out a large duffel bag and placed it on the bed with a thump. When she unzipped it, a horde of glowing battery packs and flash guns lay in front of them. Ezra picked up a flash gun with no battery, holding it in his small hands. The weapon looked too big for him, but he held it up as if he were training his sights on someone. He pretended to shoot at some invisible target across the room. "I never thought I'd be able to hold one of these." Jessica paused, then smiled at the boy. With a soft voice that bordered on motherly, Jessica reached out and touched the gun. "Want me to teach you how to use it? Just in case." Ezra nodded eagerly, and Ruth decided to get a crash course as well. It turned out Jessica was something of a gun nut, and she went into excessive detail about the types of flash pistols contained within the bag. Ruth thought they all looked more or less the same, but when she mentioned it, Jessica launched into an angry tirade about the differences in lens types, aperture diameter, battery loading compartments, and different firing techniques of each and every weapon. Ezra ate it up, carefully examining each flash gun before making his choice. Not that it really mattered in the end. He had to choose the smallest one, the only one he could handle without dropping. Jessica said that it was also the lowest capacity, which meant it had the weakest output. Ezra wouldn't likely hit anyone lethally, being more likely to inconvenience or incapacitate someone temporarily. Ruth was grateful for that fact. She didn't want her brother to actually kill anyone if it could be avoided. Jessica's current flash pistol was a standard-issue police weapon that she had taken after she had escaped the constables yesterday. It was simple in design, with a 12-shot capacity at a medium aperture. Ruth had learned enough over the past hour to know that that was fairly standard and fell somewhere in the middle of the danger scale of possible weapons. Jessica said it was a close enough approximation to the pistol she had before, the one the constables had taken. She looked down when she said it, and Ruth recalled how the girl had seemed a bit put out when they had run away. "Was the old gun that nice?" Ruth ventured cautiously. This seemed like a touchy subject, but Ruth wanted to know more about Jessica. Jessica didn't look up from the police weapon she carried, idly rubbing her thumb over the barrel. "It was a nice gun, but that's not why I wish I still had it. It was a gift from my mother." Ruth had minimal experience with mothers, but something about that sentence struck her as a bit odd. "Your mother gave you a gun? Is that normal?" Jessica chuckled softly, a small smile dancing across her face. "No, not really. She was father's partner in the GOA for a long time. She passed away just before we came here, but she left me her gun in her will. It came with a letter, and she told me to protect father with it because she couldn't anymore." Jessica's eyes welled slightly as she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Ruth cursed her big, stupid mouth for asking all these questions. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring up bad memories or anything." Ruth gently sat next to Jessica on the bed, patting her arm awkwardly. Jessica leaned closer and laid her head on Ruth's shoulder. Ruth panicked. Her entire body tensed, but on the inside she was flailing wildly. She didn't know what to do or how to act in a situation like this. How was she supposed to comfort this other girl? Would putting her arm around her seem weird? Would it be creepy? She couldn't do nothing, that would be worse. Ruth slowly wrapped an arm around Jessica's shoulder, patting her on her other arm this time. It felt a bit unnatural, but Ruth had comforted Ezra like this before. She slowly rubbed Jessica's arm, doing her best to be sympathetic. No words escaped Ruth's mouth. Everything she could think of to say felt too hollow or disingenuous. Ruth simply didn't know how to connect with Jessica in that moment using words. So the two girls simply sat there on the bed together, gently leaning on one another. With a sniffle, Jessica sat back up and rubbed her eyes, her hands coming away slightly wet. "Sorry, don't know why that hit me so hard." "'S okay," Ruth muttered, feeling awkward. She didn't feel like she had done a good job, but the moment was over now. Jessica put on a forced smile. Let me pick out a flash gun that'll suit you. That'll cheer me up. The next 20 minutes were spent with Ruth picking up, holding, aiming, and dry-firing pistols. Jessica seemed displeased with nearly every single one of them, muttering to herself about Ruth's stance and draw weight. The weapons felt odd in Ruth's hands, like they didn't belong there. Each pistol had its own issues, and Ruth was getting sick of trying them out until they reached the bottom of the bag. The last gun in the duffel was an odd one, and Jessica almost dismissed it out of hand before Ruth picked it up. This flash gun was heavy and quite a bit larger than the other pistols. It had a cylinder in the middle that held 6 whole batteries. The bulb at the base of the barrel was pointed at the end instead, or rounded, like the kind of fancy lights on a chandelier or something. The barrel of the device was long, extending well past the end of the bulb, unlike most of the other guns that were shorter. It's a revolver, Jessica explained. It uses a whole battery charge with each shot, which is super wasteful. But the beam travels further and hits hotter than pretty much any other handheld flash guns. She showed Ruth how the gun loaded, the weapon basically folding in half so that Ruth could access the battery chamber. The gun was big and heavy, and the 6 batteries attached gave off a glow that would be difficult to hide without covering the device entirely. But Ruth felt herself drawn to it. She felt powerful while holding it. "I like it. Can you show me how to shoot?" Jessica sighed, muttering something about a waste of good batteries, but walked Ruth through the process of using the flash gun, from draw to stance, and from aiming to firing. She walked Ruth and Ezra through basic safety processes, warning them repeatedly to not point the weapons toward anyone they weren't willing to shoot. She also warned them that a misplaced beam could start a fire, so keeping the barrel pointed toward the floor was usually for the best, unless someone had a carpet. The whole procedure took over 2 hours, and by the end of it, Jessica was back to anxiously glancing at the front door of the house. Michael still hadn't returned, and even Ruth was starting to grow worried. The man had been stabbed for crying out loud. Not seeing anything else to do, Ruth sighed in defeat. She was out of distractions, and other really was cause for concern at this point. "Should we go look for your dad?" Jessica looked up in surprise. "What?" "But—" She paused, then a determined look came over her face. She held out a hand as if separating herself from Ruth and Ezra. "No, I'll go. You two should stay here." Ruth shook her head. "Not going to happen. We're all going together. You just got your brother to safety. I'm not going to drag you guys into another mess." "You aren't dragging us into anything. We want to help you, so we will." End of story. The 2 girls glared at each other, and Ruth was struck with an odd feeling. She had gotten angry at Ezra before, but it was almost always because he was doing something dangerous. She felt the same way now. Jessica was taking an unnecessary risk and not taking help when it was offered. The Ruth of 2 days ago would have let her go by herself, but right now, Ruth wanted to help Jessica almost as much as she wanted to get her and her brother out of the city. "We're coming," Ruth said with finality. She and Jessica had butted heads a few times by this point, but Ruth was putting her foot down on this one. Jessica attempted to glare for a bit longer, but sighed in defeat after a moment. "I don't even know where he is. This could put us in danger for no reason." "Well, we either go out and look, or you sit here and slowly have a panic attack." Jessica flinched, unable to meet Ruth's eyes at the harsh words. But she nodded slowly, seemingly deciding to let this play out. "Fine, let me grab some holsters for you guys. No sense in going out unarmed with the city in a panic." The group quickly assembled everything they needed, and Jessica helped them put on holsters. She also grabbed them some light jackets to conceal their weapons and hide their ragged clothes. Ruth's fit nicely enough, though it was tailored to Jessica. Once more, Ruth felt like she was doing her best beauty and the beast impression when standing next to Jessica. The girl simply radiated style somehow. Ezra's jacket was much too large on him, but Ruth decided it was more important for him to conceal his weapon than for him to look a bit out of place. Satisfied, the group did all their final checks, then headed for the door. Moments before Jessica reached the doorknob, a knock sounded. Ruth quickly looked at Jessica, but the other girl simply looked at the door with concern. She slowly shook her head as the knocking continued. "Not the right password," she whispered at Ruth and Ezra. Jessica slowly drew her gun, silent as an assassin, as she carefully leveled it where the door would open. None of them made so much as a peep, Ezra and Ruth holding stock still. Ruth realized that she should probably draw her own weapon, but didn't trust herself to do it quietly. A voice sounded from the outside, muffled by the intervening door. "Excuse me, is anyone here?" There was a pause, and then the voice continued. "I'd like to speak with anyone who is home about the light of God during this trying time." The church. Ruth quickly shared a look with Jessica, and both of them felt exactly the same way at that moment. Jessica grabbed the doorknob and cracked the door open. The voice, now less muffled, sounded young and masculine. "Oh, hello there, young lady. Are your parents—" That was as far as the man got before Jessica roughly pulled the man inside. With a cry of surprise, the young man crashed into the house and fell to the floor. Jessica slammed the door, whipping around to face him. Ruth had already drawn her revolver and had it pointed at the man's head. Her voice came out as a snarl. "Start talking, dirtbag." Chapter 16. The young priest lay on the floor, looking terrified at the multiple guns now being pointed at him. His trembling hands were raised in surrender, and he let out stuttering noises of protest. Jessica stalked up to him, her face hard. She jabbed her flash gun toward him. "I said, start talking." What? The terrified man's eye kept darting between the three of them, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "To talk about what?" "About what?" Ruth asked, annoyed. "The church just helped take over the whole city. Talk about that." A flash of genuine confusion crossed the man's face, blending with the fear. Wait, no. We had nothing to do with that. It was the gangs and the power administrators." "Don't be stupid. We know that you're involved in all this." Jessica jabbed at the man with her pistol again. "The head priest of the city is involved in all this. We saw him in a meeting with the other ringleaders." "No, that's impossible. You're all crazy." The fear in the man's eyes was beginning to turn into something else. Ruth saw the telltale signs of desperation. She had seen it before. People backed into a corner were liable to lash out wildly. If they didn't get answers soon, this guy might try something crazy. "What about the Seraphs, then? They're in on this whole thing." Ruth took a gamble, betting this guy would have heard of the bizarre group. The man's whole demeanor changed in an instant. His face paled, and he stared at Ruth, slack-jawed. How do you know about that?" Ruth mentally congratulated herself. She'd hit the jackpot. Now we're getting somewhere. Jessica dragged the man's attention back to her. "We met a seraph named Saha. Ring any bells?" "No, that's impossible. That they aren't people you can just meet." The man seemed shocked by his own admission, quickly closing his mouth. He looked stricken and terrified. Ezra spoke for the first time, holstering his small flash gun. "I think he doesn't know anything about the takeover. He's a lot younger than all the church people I saw in the meeting. Let's calm down, and maybe he can be more helpful." Ezra stepped forward, reaching down to give the much bigger man a hand up. Ruth wanted to protest, but Jessica quickly caught her eye. The other girl gave a small shake of her head, stowing her flash gun. Ruth kept hers out, but pointed it low to the floor, just in case. Ezra could often earn people's trust, but Ruth wasn't quick to hand out trust at the drop of a hat. She'd be the one to act if he tried anything. Ezra let out a charming smile, the kind of genuine expression that always seemed to put him in other people's good books. "I'm Ezra. This is Jessica and Ruth. What's your name?" The man seemed struck dumb for a moment as the situation de-escalated. He slowly took Ezra's hand and got to his feet, his eyes darting to Ruth's weapon for just a moment. "I'm Marcus Jones." Jessica took a small step forward, and Marcus flinched back. "Marcus, you need to tell us everything you know about the town's takeover and the Seraphs." You're just a bunch of kids. Where are your parents? Do they know you're doing this?" Jessica frowned, and Ruth chose to step in before the guy struck a nerve. "Hey, orphan here. You need to pull it together and do what Jessica says. If you don't, a lot of innocent people will probably die." Marcus paled once again, his eyes darting to each of the kids gathered before him. "What? I don't understand. What is going on?" "You don't need to understand. You just need to tell us what we need to know. The sooner we get solid information, the sooner we can work to save people." Jessica's words carried determination and courage, but Ruth knew they were partly a lie. They had to assume that Sahar had confiscated their radio, which meant they didn't have a way to get news outside the city to the GOA, but knowing more about the Seraphs would help keep them all alive long enough to figure out the next step. Marcus swallowed heavily, meeting Jessica's eyes. You asked me about the Seraphs. How do you know about those? We met a woman who could walk in the sunlight above the city. She went by the name Sahar. You truly met one? How? Where? Marcus glanced around as if hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman. Ruth scoffed. It wasn't exactly a nice meeting. She gave my brother his black eye. Marcus shook his head frantically. That's simply not possible. They're God's chosen ones. A blessed few who have become his divine messengers on this earth. Through the power of miracles, I've heard they can walk into the light of day and not be burned. What else could they be but incarnations of angels? The way Marcus talked about the Seraphs seemed to indicate to Ruth that these rumors were being spread on purpose. The church was clearly giving people this power somehow and secretly spreading a message using faith to get the lower-rank members on board. You've never seen any? Not even a glimpse of one? No, like I said, there's only rumors about them, at least at my level, but any rumor within the clergy is based in some truth. Lies are not permitted in the church. Ruth turned to Jessica. What's the deal with all the religious mumbo-jumbo anyway? I thought they'd be some crazy experiment by a crazy doctor or something. Marcus looked offended, but Jessica headed him off. You've probably never been to church, right? At Ruth's shake of her head, Jessica continued, when the technology was invented to put holes in the sky, the church was its biggest supporter. They preach sermons all the time about the first words God ever spoke, and how we are making the earth closer to that image. Ruth raised a skeptical eyebrow. And what were the first words? Let there be light. That's it? That's the whole reason? This time, Marcus did speak up, his frustration outweighing his reservation. You're oversimplifying it. The doctrine of the Bible clearly indicates that. Jessica smacked him on the arm, continuing to talk to Ruth. Certain branches of the church lean really heavily into the whole theme. It's usually harmless, but I'm betting the people in charge of the local church branches are pretty cultish about the whole thing. So, what? Human experiments or something? Jessica shrugged. Probably. I bet the Seraphs are a recent development, some kind of groundbreaking research to make humans close to God or something. We do not. Jessica smacked Marcus's arm again. They probably take religious people who are dying in a hospital somewhere, experiment on them, then call it a miracle if it works. Ruth glared at Marcus. That's messed up. Marcus looked like he was on the verge of crying, and Ezra gently patted him on the arm. Ruth rolled her eyes. This guy reminded her of Johnny. They were both huge wusses. So Marcus here probably doesn't know anything. Is he just a rank and file? Like a dumb peer? Something like that. He won't be helpful unless he can tell us about any hospitals the church is closely related to. That would be our best lead. Both girls turned their gaze to Marcus, the man wilting slightly beneath their penetrating gazes. Well, the Helianthus General Hospital has received the support of the church for many years. We've been pushing for more work there, but I hardly think. Jessica interrupted him with a sudden burst of energy. Wait, my dad talked to me about this. I think he said that money was being laundered at that hospital somehow. He thought it had something to do with the Nosferatu gang. Jessica whipped her head around to look at the chair where Michael had been sitting the day before. The medkit was still there, and Jessica pumped her fist. That has to be where he went. I bet the medkit reminded him of it. Money laundering, that's simply not. Then that's where we're headed. I don't know the way, though. How about you, Ezra? Now hold on, you can't just break into… No, I don't remember how to get there from here. Jessica, will you all just… I don't know either. Jessica suddenly snapped her fingers in delight. Marcus can take us. That way, we won't seem as suspicious. We can pretend to be relatives or that he's escorting us. Now wait, That's a great idea. He probably goes there all the time. I bet he could get us in easily. Well, I do, but it's settled then. Marcus will act as a guardian for us, and we'll go sneak into the hospital to try and find your dad. Marcus, you okay? I hate you all. As it turned out, Ruth didn't even need to keep a gun trained on Marcus to get him to help. For some reason, the young priest simply went along with the plan. He seemed oddly determined for some reason and kept glancing at the group of kids indignantly. Ruth leaned over and whispered to Jessica, "He's not going to be a problem, is he?" Jessica thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't think so. I'm betting he's taking us so that he can personally show us that the hospital is innocent or something." "Doesn't he have better things to do?" Ruth flinched as someone smashed a door to a shop down nearby. "The city is in chaos right now." Jessica shrugged. "Religious people are weird like that. When you accuse their beliefs, they can ignore a lot of other messed up stuff to prove themselves right. So what happens when he's proven wrong?" Jessica didn't answer the question, letting it hang in the air between them. Ruth idly fingered her gun beneath her jacket, knowing full well that she would use it if the priest decided to do something drastic. Ezra seemed entirely unaware of the looming confrontation, having quickly decided to befriend the priest. Marcus seemed very uninterested in genuinely getting along with the boy, but plastered a fake smile on and did his best to placate him. Ruth knew that Ezra could likely tell that Marcus wasn't genuine, but Ezra had a way of sticking to people like glue, and she thought that in a pinch, Marcus might let some affection for her brother make him flinch back from taking a drastic action. It was a calculated risk, but not much of one. If it gave Marcus even a moment of hesitation, she would be able to act on it. Ruth sighed, shaking her head. What had the world come to, that she was walking around the city with a flash gun, prepared to use it on someone? She had sworn that this sort of thing would never become her life. But life had forced its way on her. A glance at Jessica revealed nothing more than a calm, calculating look on the other girl's face as she observed Marcus. Ruth idly wondered if Jessica had ever shot someone with her flash gun before, if she had ever had to defend herself with lethal force. Ruth hoped not. Jessica would probably do it, but Ruth found herself thinking that it would be so terrible if the other girl had been forced into a situation like that. A girl like Jessica shouldn't have to live with the harshness of the world. There was so much about Jessica that Ruth didn't understand. Her life seemed so ridiculous, so outlandish, that Ruth didn't know if she had ever met the real girl at all. A dad who worked as a government spy, special training to use lethal weapons, planning secret routes through the most secure places in the city. Jessica was crazy, and that crazy appealed to Ruth in a way she didn't fully understand. But there was another part to Jessica, the girl who wanted to go shopping and sit beneath the sky. A girl who missed her mother and who just wanted to make her father proud. A sweet, caring girl who laughed and cried just like anyone else. Not for the first time, Ruth mentally chided herself for trusting Jessica so easily. She was in too deep to back out now, and honestly, Ruth liked her a lot. But putting all her eggs in this basket seemed like a recipe for disaster. It was one crisis after another, and while Jessica had been helpful and reliable, there was no telling when that help might end. Ruth couldn't let herself trust anyone except her brother. All the promises of safety and escape from the city meant nothing if Jessica and Michael couldn't follow through. Ruth wanted, no needed, Jessica to follow through. Escaping, going somewhere new and safe, the promise of time spent together after it was all over. There was no choice but to stick with Jessica, but maybe Ruth would keep her close, even if they did have a choice. The girl was a magnet for danger and disaster, but Ruth had never met someone who handled it as well as Jessica did. With the exception of herself, of course. Jessica noticed Ruth's glances and sent a questioning look her way, no doubt wondering if Ruth was trying to communicate with her silently. When Ruth flushed a bit and shook her head, Jessica just flashed a tiny smile, then returned her gaze to Marcus's back. That tiny smile hit Ruth in the chest, and she nearly reeled back. Ruth had only known Jessica for 2 days, but in this moment, if anything happened to her, Ruth might honestly consider burning the whole city to the ground. The thought was crazy, totally ridiculous in every way. And yet, "We're here," Marcus said from up front. Helianthus General Hospital stood before them. It was one of those rare buildings that didn't have any other structures built on top of it, with the exception of the city's ceiling panels. About 9 stories tall, it was a simple rectangular shape that illuminated the space around it with plenty of exterior lights. A few ambulances sat idle outside the building, big squat things that Ruth barely ever saw in action. However, crowds of people were rushing in and out of the building with a variety of injuries. Ruth belatedly realized that rioters and protesters were either getting hurt or hurting people. That meant there was increased traffic into the hospital, one of the only major places for medical attention in the area. She looked to Jessica. "Think we can sneak through with all these people here?" Jessica grinned. "No need for that. We just need to ask to see an existing patient." When Ruth gave her a quizzical look, Jessica's smile broadened. "I just so happen to know a man with a stab wound who came to this hospital very recently." Chapter 17. A quick check at the front desk showed a few people who had checked in with relatively recent stab wounds. However, when Jessica described her father, the nurse made a distasteful expression. "Tried to stitch his own wound closed, bloody fool." Jessica frowned, seeming like she wanted to retort, but Ruth was able to drag her away toward the room the nurse pointed them to. "Go check on your dad. Ezra and I will take Marcus to the ward that the church goes to all the time. We'll meet you in your dad's room in a half-hour." Jessica nodded, splitting off from the group to go check on her father. Splitting up may not be the best choice, but Ruth knew that there was no point in all of them visiting Michael. They had work to do, and they wouldn't be able to keep using Marcus for help after this. Even if he changed loyalties, he was pretty much dead weight unless he could get them somewhere restricted. So Ruth decided to divide and conquer, opting to make use of the priest while Jessica retrieved her dad. Ruth, Ezra, and Marcus walked down the hallways of the hospital. Nurses, doctors, and patients all sat or walked down the hallways, a constant flow that seemed to fill the entire building. Lights hung all around, illuminating the halls and emitting a gentle buzzing noise. The air smelled like rubbing alcohol, and Ruth's nose crinkled in displeasure. She hadn't been to a hospital since her parents passed, and this whole building made her feel annoyed and sad. Before long, the group reached an elevator which opened just as they arrived. They made their way inside, squeezing past a crying family that was exiting the cramped space. Ruth ignored the scene. The family was well dressed, which meant they would get zero sympathy from her. They could cry when they had nothing left. Marcus gave a small condolence to the family, then hit a button. The elevator began to rise, and Ezra clutched the handle attached to the wall in surprise. He had never been on an elevator before. Marcus had informed the group that the church often worked in the intensive care ward, mostly dealing with hospice patients and the like. He continued to resist the idea that the church was doing something unsavory, proclaiming that he often visited this ward with senior members of the clergy. He told several stories of visiting patients and spending countless hours with them until they passed away, comfortable and ready. Ruth believed him when he said that he came here a lot. He seemed like a bleeding heart, a guy who did his good deeds with a smile on his face and a clear conscience. It made him seem like a moron in her opinion. In fact, it nearly made Ruth angry that he thought he was helping people by visiting people who were guaranteed to die soon. Where was the help for her? Help for her brother? Ruth had never seen any real attempt by the church to help kids on the streets. In fact, they often got shooed away, lest they damaged the church or something ridiculous like that. Now that she thought about it, maybe they were trying to force the street kids to find work with the gangs. If all these groups were working together, that might make sense. Marcus seemed innocent enough, but he was in deep. A true believer who didn't see anything wrong with the church's actions. Well, hopefully that would change soon enough. If they could find some evidence of the church taking people from this hospital and turning them into seraphs, that would knock some sense into him. Maybe he would even try to do something about it. Not that Ruth really wanted to be involved with him longer than necessary. Ruth idly wondered if finding the information she was looking for would also help Jessica and her father. It would help point some blame for the city's takeover and probably scare some very important people enough to do something about it. She was mostly searching for it to see if there was anything she could take advantage of, some weakness or restriction on the seraphs as a whole. At least, that's what she told herself. It was difficult to know exactly what she was working for at this point. Helping Jessica meant helping herself and her brother to escape Helianthus. But giving help meant putting themselves in a dangerous position, possibly even a deadly one. Everything had been happening so quickly lately that it was hard to stop and wonder if she should actually be doing all this or not. The idea of leaving Jessica to fend for herself seemed so impossible. Before, Ezra had been the one and only person Ruth cared about. She didn't give a crap about anyone else until Jessica had helped them escape on that rooftop. There had been a moment where Jessica's act had slipped, and the girl who genuinely cared showed her face for just an instant. Ruth wanted more of that. She wanted to see more of that face that cared so much. The elevator dinged as they stopped on the 7th floor, interrupting her thoughts. Marcus led Ruth and Ezra out into a long hallway that was less full than the ground floor had been. There was still hospital staff milling around, but not as many people filled the halls. Marcus turned to look at Ruth. "I brought you both here so you can see that the church is not doing anything evil." His tone was almost condescending, but Ruth suspected it was actually closer to nervousness and desperation. Marcus likely thought that Ruth, Ezra, and Jessica were all crazy, and he was doing everything he could to defuse them. No doubt he thought of himself as some sacrificing hero, putting himself in danger to try and set them on the right path, or some nonsense like that. Ruth just shrugged, not really caring about his motivations. "Did you know a woman from here? Blonde and super religious? Skinny, with green eyes?" Marcus paused as if thinking. "I knew 1 or 2 women like that, yes. I just visited one of them a little over a week ago." "Are they still here?" "I'm not sure. Why?" "Because Saha, the seraph, was like that, and she might have some from here." Ruth pushed Marcus further down the hall. "Let's go." Marcus looked a bit indignant, but then his eyes flashed to where Ruth still had her gun stashed beneath her coat. He sighed, straightened, then led them to a room down the hall. Walking in, Ruth could see the room stretched out, beds every 5 or 6 feet on either side. People lay in the beds, all in varying states of unconsciousness. Marcus clasped his hands together and muttered a quick prayer before leading Ruth and Ezra past several beds. The nurses clearly recognized him and gave him quiet greetings, glancing curiously at what they probably assumed to be a patient's family members. When they got close to one of the beds at the end of the room, Marcus paused. Ruth glanced over and saw that nobody was in it. In fact, there was nothing to indicate someone had been in it for a while. He tapped a nurse on the shoulder, grabbing her attention. "Excuse me, I was hoping to see Sarah. Did she have a surgery scheduled today?" The nurse looked at Marcus with pity. "I'm sorry, preacher. Sarah passed away about a week ago." The nurse focused on Ruth and Ezra. "Were you family?" Marcus stepped between the nurse and Ruth, chuckling nervously. "I'm sorry. Did you say she passed away?" "How? I thought she was stable." The nurse gave one more glance toward Ezra, then leaned in conspiratorially toward Marcus. "I wasn't working that night, but I heard they wanted to try some experimental treatment. Sarah volunteered, so they took her back to the operating room for an invasive procedure. She never came back out." Ruth made eye contact with Ezra, raising an eyebrow. That sounded an awful lot like human experiments to Ruth. If Sarah and Saha were the same person, then she would have been dying a week ago. Now she was immune to the sun and clearly strong and fast. Ruth needed to confirm Sraha's identity, and this nurse seemed like a good place to start. Were there any members of the church present? Ruth did her best innocent teen act, but the nurse didn't seem to buy it. She glanced up at Marcus, who nodded for her to answer the question. Well, yes. There were a few priests who attended the surgery from the viewing room. Sarah asked for constant prayer during the procedure. Ezra spoke next. Who was the doctor who did the surgery? The nurse smiled down at him, and she looked at him completely differently than she had at Ruth. Dr. Rains. He's the lead surgeon for this floor, and he handles many of the procedures with his own dedicated team. It annoyed Ruth that she got treated so differently, but at least Ezra was grabbing good info out of the woman. Is he here today? I want to thank him for trying to save Auntie Sarah. Ezra looked up at the nurse sadly, and Ruth saw the woman melt. Ruth had to hold back from rolling her eyes. He is. The nurse pointed down the hall. Father Marcus can take you to see him. His office is down the hall left, then it's on the right. You can't miss it. Thank you, Mom. Ezra beamed at her, and she smiled brightly at him. The group began to wander toward the surgeon's office, and Marcus looked down at Ezra, seeming stunned at his performance. Ezra, for his part, simply looked up at the priest and smiled. Ruth restrained herself from laughing. Ezra was a great kid, but he really knew how to lay it on thick when he had to. Ruth had taught him how to lie well, and he took it to a level that she could never hope to match with his natural charm. As the group made their way to Dr. Rain's office, Marcus glanced at Ruth warily. He was probably worried she might do something crazy. She still didn't understand why Marcus had agreed to all this, but she wasn't about to complain about the access he was providing for them. If a confrontation happened, she would need to be careful he didn't get the jump on her, but she wasn't especially worried about it. He seemed like a pushover. Dr. Rain's office was closed when they arrived. Marcus knocked and tried the door. It was unlocked, and he peered inside. Ruth pushed past him, not concerned with being polite, drawing her gun as she entered. The office was nothing special, a square room with a few paintings on the walls. There were a few chairs, a desk for the doctor, and a row of filing cabinets in the back. The doctor appeared to be out and about, and Ruth and Ezra quickly moved to the cabinets. Ezra began leafing through papers. He could read slightly better than Ruth, and took every opportunity to practice. Ruth hadn't cared as much, something that she was regretting now. "What's Sarah's last name?" Marcus looked worriedly between the files and the door. "You can't just dig through those, they're private." Ruth gave him a withering look. "It's not like we understand most of this anyway. Besides, if Sarah really is dead, then it doesn't matter if we look at her file." Marcus hesitated, then moved forward. He rifled through the cabinet before pulling a file. "Here, Sarah McKen. Are you satisfied now?" "Yup, I'm very satisfied." The picture on file was nearly a perfect match for Saha, the seraph. She had gained a few pounds since leaving the hospital, but that made her look more normal if anything. Sarah had been terminally ill with a disease Ruth didn't even know how to pronounce, and she only had a few more months left to live. Clearly, her time spent since being released from the hospital had done her well, though Ruth was sure weird human experimentation had helped too. Her experimental surgery had been documented. It was something new, sponsored by a mysterious benefactor of the hospital. Ruth flipped through the pages with Ezra, looking for anything incriminating in the information. On the very last page, there were only 3 sentences. Ruth read them with a growing sense of dread. "For the light of God, for the light of progress, for the light of freedom." She had heard those words spoken in the meeting between the 3 groups who had now taken over the city. The light of God line had been spoken by the head priest. The light of progress line had been spoken by Barbara Lumen, head of the Helianthus power plant. And the light of freedom line had been spoken by Vlad, leader of the Nosferatu gang. The light of God bit was clearly full of religious implication, and Ruth suspected it was the mantra of whatever weird cult stuff they had going on. It probably also had to do with the seraphs and their immunity to sunlight. The light of freedom was clearly about declaring independence. The gang wasn't content to rule in the shadows anymore. They obviously wanted to run this city, fighting to take it from the people who had run it before. Though freedom was a bit of an odd choice of phrase. The light of progress bit, Ruth wasn't sure about. Maybe some kind of experimentation or new invention. Michael might have an answer for her. They simply didn't have enough info to work with for now. Ruth showed Marcus the documents, explaining to him about what had happened in the meeting between the 3 factions. He still didn't look convinced, but his expression grew less and less sure as she spoke. Ruth had confirmed that Saha had come from this hospital and that the staff here clearly did some kind of dangerous experimental treatment that turned her into a seraph. The 3 sentences, the mysterious backer, and the experimental surgery all pointed straight to it. If she had the time, she might be able to find files on the other seraphs, but she would have to look at hundreds of patients. There simply wasn't time right now. She tucked the file in her jacket, and the group made for the door, Ruth still holding her gun in case Marcus started getting too antsy. They would meet up with Jessica and Michael, plan their next move, then get out of there. Ruth cracked the door open and froze in surprise. There was a man in a doctor's coat standing just outside the door, his own hand frozen in mid-air where he had been about to grab the doorknob. His name tag identified him as Dr. Rains. Chapter 18. In a single moment, Dr. Rains took in the entire room. His eyes widened in shock as he saw Ezra before they snapped back to Ruth. His hand dropped to his side, and the world seemed to slow down. Ruth realized 2 things in that moment. The man had recognized Ezra. He also had a flash gun at his waist, Her own weapon was still in her hand, and she raised it toward the man, toward her enemy. As Dr. Rains drew a small flash pistol from a holster on his side, Ruth fired into his leg. The doctor screamed in pain as an incredibly bright beam of light seared through the air, blinding them for a moment. Dr. Rains crashed to the ground, a hole burned straight through his left leg. Ruth could see through the wound she had made and noted that the floor had been slightly melted at the impact point of the laser. Ruth was momentarily stunned at the carnage before Ezra grabbed her and rushed them out into the hallway. Marcus did not follow them, instead rushing to check on the wounded doctor. People began to cry out, the flash of light alerting people to something happening. Dr. Rain's screams of pain filled the hall as Ruth and Ezra dashed away from the scene. This was bad, really bad. She had shot a man, probably crippled him for life. He had been pulling a gun on her, but still. Ruth's earlier bravado and certainty that she could and would use a weapon if required faltered. She looked down at the pistol in her hand, realizing belatedly that she should probably stash it away again. The glow of the flash revolver was slightly dimmer, one of the 6 batteries having been completely drained of its charge. I shot him, me. I used a deadly weapon just like that. It was amazing what the mind could do in a moment of adrenaline. Ruth had been confident that she could wield something like a flash gun if it came down to it, but she had fired before fully coming to terms with the situation. It had been him or her, and she had acted on gut instinct. Still, at least he would probably live. If she was going to hurt someone that badly, at least they were already in a hospital. They might have to remove the leg, but Dr. Rains could still pull through just fine. That caused a small amount of relief to flood through Ruth's mind as she realized she was glad she probably hadn't killed the man. But despite her relief, she felt an oppressive truth settle over her. She knew she could kill. She knew that she would probably have to kill before this was all over. The chances of escaping the city without firing her weapon again were probably laughable. It would hurt. It might even break her. But she could do it. As she stashed the gun, her feet pounding heavily as she and Ezra sprinted into a stairwell, she made the decision that she would always be the one to try and shoot first. She didn't want Ezra to feel like this. She didn't want Jessica to feel like this. If Michael could do the shooting, that would be great. But Ruth knew that the burden would fall to her, and she would rather carry that weight than give it to someone she cared about. The siblings rushed down the stairs, taking the steps in 2s and 3s. Jessica and Michael were on the ground floor. They just had to get to them before. An alarm began to sound through the hospital. Flashing red lights filled the stairwell, and a blaring horn began to whine over speakers attached to the walls. There was no audio message, but Ruth knew that it was only a matter of minutes before hospital security began hunting them down, if they weren't already. It was past time to get out of here. Just over a minute later, Ruth and Ezra burst out onto the first floor. It had been hectic when they had arrived, but people were in a full-blown panic now. The alarm had caused dozens of people to assume there was a riot going on, and the fear had spread like wildfire. Doctors and nurses rushed to try and calm the panicking people, and Ruth saw a few security guards running around to restrain the more wild ones. Down the hall, Ruth spotted Jessica peeking out of a patient's room, and they made a beeline for her. Jessica quickly ushered them inside, closing the door behind her and locking it. Michael lay on one of the beds in the room, looking much the same as the last time Ruth had seen him. There were 3 other patients in the room, but none of them appeared to have visitors at the moment. They were all looking around worriedly, one of them hitting a button next to his bed non-stop. "What happened? It's only been 10 minutes, Jessica exclaimed. "Where's Marcus?" Ruth tossed the folder of patient information at Michael, and he began leafing through it. "The doctor performing the Seraph surgery discovered us. He had a flash gun, and I had to shoot him in the leg. Marcus stayed behind while we ran." Jessica's eyes widened, and she glanced down at where Ruth's revolver was hidden. "Is his leg still there?" This time, Ruth's eyes widened. She looked at Jessica, horrified. "Wait, I could have taken his leg off with this thing." Michael glanced up. "You gave her the revolver. What were you thinking?" Jessica looked down, seeming shamed. Her voice was soft as she muttered her response. It was the only one she wanted. "I just wanted them to be able to protect themselves." Michael sighed. "We can talk about it later. For now, we need to leave." "But the doctor said you—" Michael cut off his daughter's objections. I don't care what the doctor said. I'll be fine. For now, we need to get out of here before the constables arrive. Help me up. Jessica moved forward to help her father, Ezra quickly moving in to help as well. Ruth just glared at the man, annoyed that he hadn't even thanked them for risking themselves like this. Not to mention the fact that he was judging Jessica for doing her best. No one else seemed to notice Ruth's frustrations, instead moving closer to the door to the hall. Michael unlocked the door and peeked out. He cursed and quickly shut the door again. Too late. A thrall just arrived with a collection of thugs and constables. Ruth looked toward the outer wall, noting fortunately that there was a window to the room. Out the window. The group shuffled Michael over to the window and Ruth tugged it open. The patient who had been pressing the button non-stop was staring at them all with wide, panicked eyes. He began to loudly call out for a nurse. That would probably draw attention a bit too quickly. Moving Michael was slow going, especially if they had to help him climb out. If a nurse or doctor came in, that would complicate things. They needed to bar the door somehow. But before Ruth could make a move to do it, Jessica rushed back over to the door. She grabbed a chair, aiming to jam it under the handle. But before Jessica could bar the door, it crashed open, slamming into her. A booted foot returned to the floor, having kicked the door nearly off its hinges. Jessica flew back before crashing against a bed, slumping over a few feet from where she had been standing. She wasn't moving, and Ruth almost rushed over to her in panic. Michael cursed, then shoved Ezra out the window. Ruth cried out, reaching for her brother, and Michael took the chance to shove her as well. Ruth tumbled to the ground outside, landing on top of Ezra before scrambling to her feet. She got back up, but Michael was kneeling in front of the window, blocking her view of the room. "Run!" He slammed the window shut, spinning back around as quickly as he could. Ruth hesitated for just a moment, but then she saw what was happening in the room. 6 men had rushed in, all with tattoos, flash gun burns, or constable uniforms. They all had weapons, either pistols or truncheons. Ruth even spotted a few more in the hallway. She ran. Ezra sprinted alongside her, neither of them stopping as they booked it away from the hospital. Ruth's mind raced as she pumped her legs. How had the goons gotten there so fast? Had Michael been discovered beforehand, and the gang had been coming to get him? What were the odds that this would all happen at the worst possible time? Before they had even been running for 3 minutes, a form crashed down onto the street in front of her, and she and Ezra scrambled to a stop. A lightly dressed bald man stood up from his kneeling position in front of them. His clothes consisted of shorts and a tank top, and his muscular body was on full display as he moved with powerful grace. He had a circle of swirling lines tattooed around the top of his head, like a halo that had sunk down onto his skin. It didn't take Ruth longer than a second to guess what he was. A seraph. He stood there, ominous and creepy, as he observed them quietly. Ruth was tense, her body ready to bolt at the slightest hint of movement. Ezra slowly drew his flash gun from its holster, and the man simply watched him with a completely neutral expression. Ruth and Ezra had dealt with fights before. Life on the streets meant that you had to know how to take care of yourself. All their time siphoning had given them the ability to work together and react to one another almost without thought. And Ruth took advantage of that in this moment. She didn't have her gun out, so she did the next best thing she could think of. Backwards to how they would normally do this maneuver, Ruth dashed off to one side to try and distract the target. Usually Ezra would do this so that Ruth could close in and attack the distracted target. In this case, Ezra was the closer considering his gun was out. He whipped his flash pistol up and fired 2 quick shots. The man's gaze lazily followed Ruth as she dashed to the side, barely registering Ezra shooting at him. The beams of light weren't nearly as bright or big as Ruth's had been back in the hospital, but even still they would probably be powerful at such a close range. One of the shots went wide, flying past him only to dissipate a little ways down the street. The second shot nailed him right on the arm. Ruth had expected some kind of reaction from the man, maybe holding his arm in pain or screaming bloody murder. Instead, the man seemed completely unconcerned with having been shot, his eyes still locked to Ruth. The beam of light had hit his skin directly on account of his tank top, but it hadn't even left a red mark at the point of contact. Suddenly, the man burst forward in a flash of speed that caught Ruth off guard, moving with unnatural haste. He reached out and grabbed her with ease, his hand crushing down on her arm. She yelled, both out of surprise and pain. Ezra hesitated, his gun trailing downward, unwilling to take another shot with his sister so close to the target. The man held tight to Ruth, his grip like steel around her arm. He turned back to Ezra, still completely silent, as he gestured for him to come closer. Ezra glanced at Ruth, unsure of what to do. Ruth's face twisted in pain as the man squeezed harder, her arm flaring with pain. "Run, Ezra! Get out of here!" The man released a silent sigh, then began dragging Ruth toward her brother. Ezra began backing up, still hesitating. She scrambled against his grip, but his strength was clearly enhanced beyond normal means, and he didn't even budge backwards as she tugged at her arm fiercely. Ruth knew that she was caught, but she would rather burn in the light of day than let this scumbag grab her brother. She whipped her flash revolver out of her jacket. "Hey, dead man, pretty sure you belong in a hospital bed, not beating up kids." The man stopped, his head swinging down as an angry expression overtook him. In that same moment, Ruth thrust her flash gun up, the barrel cracking against the man's teeth as she pulled the trigger 5 times in rapid succession. The world exploded in light, and the man let out the first sound Ruth had heard from him since he had arrived. It was an agonizing, pained scream. As her eyes cleared, Ruth stared in horror at the man. The skin of his mouth was melting off, exposing jawbone that had been blackened by the beams of light. She wasn't afraid of how he looked, but she was terrified that despite the damage she had done, his head was still attached to his body. How tough was this guy? The man's hand reared back, and before Ruth could even think about reacting, she heard a vicious crack as her head spun sideways. Then everything went black. Chapter 19. Ruth slowly came back to consciousness, her jaw aching fiercely. She couldn't see anything, and as her brain slowly began to focus, she started to panic. She squirmed, trying to move, but her hands were bound behind her back. She tried to yell, but found a gag in her mouth that prevented any speech. All she could get out were pained, muffled noises. Belatedly, she realized she was blindfolded as well, instead of blinded, laying down against a cold, hard surface. This was a nightmare situation. Trapped somewhere, with no knowledge of where her brother was, or if he was even still alive. Ruth had no doubt that the seraph had gotten to him. Despite his face melting, he had still easily knocked her unconscious. Ruth let out several loud yells, not caring if her captors learned she was awake. If they came to check on her, then at least she would find out who had her right now. She tested her bindings, trying to see if there was any chance she could slip out of them, but they were tight and firm around her arms and legs. She continued to struggle and try to free herself for several minutes, making as much noise as possible. Finally, she was rewarded with the sound of approaching footsteps. A door opened, and the clack, clack, clack of shoes on floor pointedly moved in her direction. "Oh, for heaven's sake, do be quiet." The voice was feminine and haughty, reprimanding her like she was a naughty kid instead of a captive. It sounded familiar, and Ruth realized with a start that it was the voice of Barbara Lumen, the woman who owned the power plant. Why was one of the rebellion leaders here? "Language," a softer, also feminine voice chided. "Heaven does not deserve your blasphemy." "Yes, yes, I don't actually mean it." Ruth could hear the exasperated sarcasm roll of Barbara's tongue. "Heaven is sacred, yada yada. Now will you deal with the girl?" The other woman sighed, and a rustle of fabric came from in front of her. Ruth felt hands on her head, and gentle fingers removed the blindfold she was wearing. Ezra had described Barbara as a kind of tall, chubby lady who wore very ugly clothes. Ruth was inclined to agree with those words. Barbara Lumen clearly enjoyed the finer things in life, pudgy and dressed in the fanciest, gaudiest dress Ruth had ever seen. It was floral print, but whoever had made it clearly wanted every single inch of it to be completely covered in flower designs. There was no rhyme or reason to the pattern. Different colored flowers of all shapes and sizes shone haphazardly over the form-hugging dress. It was not a good look, and Ruth couldn't imagine anyone actually wanting to wear something like that. The other woman was much more subdued by comparison, though her fashion was odd as well. She wore loose robes with a deep hood. Her long brown hair spilled out of the hood over one shoulder in an intricate braid that fell down to her chest. Ruth couldn't see many details about the woman's face, shadowed as it was by the hood, but her hands were bone white. The woman smiled eerily at Ruth, the shadows of the hood giving her an ominous appearance. "Good evening, child. Are you well?" Before Ruth could even attempt a response, Barbara huffed loudly. "Well, of course she isn't. Shatil nearly took her head off." The other woman sighed again, tutting lightly with her tongue. The girl did melt most of his lower jaw. He can hardly be blamed for reacting as he did. The tone was gentle, but there was a tiny edge to her voice. It left no room for debate. Ruth shuddered at the firmness in the mysterious woman's words. Barbara seemed completely oblivious to the subtle shift in the other woman, continuing to ramble. "Well, that's what he gets for messing around. Honestly, what kind of idiot messes up capturing 2 children?" There was a long moment of silence, tension slowly filling them room. The woman didn't turn around to face Barbara, but the chubby woman began to shuffle awkwardly. After a prolonged pause, she cleared her throat, looking away. I'm sorry, Remiel. That was rude of me." The hooded woman smiled softly, turning her face toward Barbara. "All is forgiven. Besides, you and your team are working on treating him, are you not?" This was an insane conversation. Who was this hooded woman? Another seraph, maybe. It was the only reason Ruth could think of that a woman like Barbara, one of the leaders of the citywide takeover, would be nervous. The pale, shadowed woman in front of her could probably rip someone like Barbara to shreds in seconds if she wanted to. Remiel seemed to sense Ruth's confusion, returning her attention to her once again. "Child, I'm going to remove your gag. You may scream if you wish, but no one will be able to hear you except Miss Lumen and myself." After a moment of hesitation, Ruth nodded. Remiel removed the gag, letting it hang from Ruth's neck. "Where am I?" Ruth asked, letting her gaze drift around the room. It was a broad, concrete room with no real features to speak of. There was a single lamp hanging from the ceiling and a door at the far wall. Ruth guessed it was some kind of storage space. It was possible they were in the basement of the power plant. "In a secure location," Remiel said easily, her words matter of fact. "You'll have to understand that I won't reveal exactly where we are. You and your friends have proven quite slippery after all." "So they're here. Ezra, Jessica." Barbara crossed her arms, looking down at Ruth imperiously. "And Michael as well. You've all been brought here to answer our questions." "Questions? What the hell could they all want to know? I'm not saying anything until I know they're all safe." This was a bit of a gamble, but if they needed Ruth to talk, she had some leverage. She was grateful that no gang members were part of this interrogation. They would probably start trying to beat the answers out of her. Barbara's face began to pinch, her brow furrowing and her lips pouting. She looked like she had just eaten a lemon. "I'm afraid that won't be—" "Of course, dear child," Remiel interrupted. "Shall we begin by going to see your brother?" Barbara just looked at Remiel with shock. "What? You can't just—" But Remiel simply lifted Ruth to her feet, easily undoing the ropes tying her ankles together. "I'll be leaving your hands bound, of course. But by this point, I suspect you know better than to try and fight back." Remiel's voice did that thing again. She was somehow calm and oppressive at the same time. Once more, Ruth could sense that this woman was not to be messed with. Barbara grabbed Remiel's arm, hissing, "That's not the plan. We don't have time for this." Remiel simply regarded the other woman calmly. "I have foreseen this to be beneficial to us." The words seemed to pain Barbara, who released Remiel with a complicated expression. She huffed for a moment, then spun towards the door without another word. Ruth followed them, studying the dynamic these two shared. The seraph, for she had to be a seraph with how easily she had lifted Ruth, was clearly another religious nut. Barbara clearly felt like she should be in charge, but seemed oddly subservient to Remiel. It spoke of some interplay Ruth didn't yet understand. Perhaps the alliance between the 3 groups who had taken over the city was already cracked and fractured. Even besides that, what was all that force in talk? Stepping out into the hall, Ruth didn't see any other features that would indicate where she was. The hallway was simply a long concrete box that extended in both directions from her. There were 6 doors, 3 on each side of the hall, with another 2 doors on each end of the hallway. Barbara led them down the hall and stood in front of one of the doors, opening it when they drew close. Ezra sat in the room, flanked by 2 thuggish-looking men. They were kneeling next to her brother, poking and prodding him as he kept his gaze glued to the floor. When the door opened, all three of them looked up, and Ezra's face melted with relief. Ruth moved to rush forward, trying to reach her brother, but a grip of iron on her shoulder stopped her in her tracks. Remiel spoke in her ear. "You have seen your brother's safety. Shall we move on to Miss Jessica now?" Ruth tried to shake off the hooded woman's grip, but she knew it was fruitless. The hand remained, as if glued to her shoulder. "I want to talk to him." "I'm afraid that won't be possible yet. We haven't finished questioning him, or you for that matter. Any communication the two of you make will cause us to trust you even less." Ezra looked like he wanted to rush forward, but the two goons held him tightly, their quiet voices murmuring in his ear. He deflated slightly, and Ruth felt herself growing hot with anger. "Fine, I'll answer your stupid questions, just don't hurt him." Barbara looked at Ruth in surprise, even as Remiel nodded, as if she had expected this. "We will not harm him, but do you not wish to see your other companions as well? I am willing to take you to them." Ruth hesitated, then turned to face Remiel. The hooded woman actually let her, releasing her shoulder. "What happens after we answer your questions? Do you kill us or something?" Remiel chuckled, her tiny laughter full of mirth. "It is not up to me, but I will push those in charge to release you and your brother. The two of you have done nothing wrong other than being led astray." Ruth noticed the exclusion immediately, her heart speeding up in fear. "And Jessica and her dad? What about them?" Remiel shook her head. "I'm afraid that they represent a real threat to our little kingdom. It pains me to punish a child, but a sinner is a sinner, no matter the age." Remiel seemed slightly sorrowful, her expression one of resigned sadness, as if the idea of killing a teenager was something that couldn't be helped. "That's not going to work for me, lady." Ruth glared up at the hooded woman, her temper flaring and overpowering her fear. Remiel nodded pensively, again acting as if that was the expected response. She smiled gently, and Ruth fought the urge to punch her in the nose. "Come with me, child. I wish to show you something." Ruth didn't really have a choice, so she followed Remiel. She glanced back at Ezra, trying to smile encouragingly as he smiled weakly back. The door shut, and they began walking down the hallway towards one of the doors at the end. Barbara followed behind them silently, seeming completely out of her element as she muttered to herself. Remiel opened the door at the end of the hall, and they stepped into a small room with windows on one side. Ruth glanced through them and was surprised to see another room through the glass. They stood suspended above a large room with a bed situated in the middle. Large machines, lamps, and various tools all surrounded the bed. "It's a surgery room," Remiel explained. Her eyes were fixed on the bed, her full attention on it. It was empty as far as Ruth could tell. "Surgery? Like what you had?" Remiel raised one of her bone-white hands, turning it over as it reflected the lamplight. "Yes, exactly like what I had." The door to the surgery room swung open, and several people pushed a bed inside. The people were covered from head to toe with what appeared to be some kind of tarp. They wore heavy-looking masks and huge gloves over the fabric that covered every inch of skin. Barbara looked at Remiel, appalled. "They're just starting now. He was injured hours ago." Ruth looked at the bed that was being wheeled in and realized there was someone on it. The people, probably doctors of some kind if Ruth had to guess, lifted part of the bed up and used it to maneuver the person onto the central bed table in the room. The other bed was shoved away, and Ruth got her first real look at who was receiving surgery. To her shock, it was Dr. Rains. He was unconscious, lying on the table and looking deathly pale. Now that she was studying him, she could see there were some machines around his leg, probably preventing him from bleeding out somehow. "Jesus, that poor man," Barbara muttered before quickly slapping a hand over her mouth. She glanced at Remiel. Remiel only sighed, not even turning to look at Barbara. "Language, Miss Lumen, please." Ruth could barely give her attention to the two women, her eyes completely trapped by the sight of Dr. Rains on the table. The doctors around him were flitting about the room, prepping equipment and turning on machines. "Are they going to try and fix his leg?" Ruth asked a bit nervously. "I'm pretty sure you can't fix a hole that big." The memory of blowing a hole in the man's leg earlier that day was still fresh in her mind. It was the kind of wound that she expected would cripple him for life. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to stay injured or not. Not yet. He's due for something a bit more invasive than that. Ruth was about to ask what she meant by that when the door to the surgery room burst open again. A cart rolled in, completely covered in huge metal tanks. The tanks were huge and solidly built, but they didn't look like they fit on any of the machines in the surgery room. They had large valves at their tops, with huge screw-on toppers to keep something in. One of the surgeons pulled out a comically huge needle from under the central bed. It was bigger than Ruth's arm, and she gawked at the size of it. The doctors looked up to the surgery viewing room and made a gesture, covering where their eyes were beneath their masks with their hands. Barbara flipped a switch and the glass dimmed significantly. The view into the surgery room became almost completely black. Ruth had to lean close and squint to barely make out what was going on. So she was surprised when light suddenly burst from within the surgery room, filling the viewing chamber with a bright flash. She squinted her eyes, still trying to make out what was happening, but the room below was now completely unwatchable. The dark glass combined with the glaring light, and she could no longer make out any details at all. What are they doing? Barbara looked equal parts smug and concerned, as if proud and terrified of whatever was going on. They're performing the seraph surgery. Ruth spun, staring at Barbara with shock. What? Remiel stood in between them, her eyes still staring at the room below, seeming unbothered by the blinding light coming from within. She seemed to be completely blocking out Barbara and Ruth's words. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. She clasped her hands in front of her, speaking almost reverently as she repeated the words over and over. Barbara simply rolled her eyes at the display of faith, turning back to Ruth. It's my invention, you know. Liquid light. We inject it into every part of the body, and if the patient is lucky, they are changed forever. Ruth just looked at her, horrified. She did not understand what that meant, but she knew that this woman was just as crazy as the seraphs. Why are you showing me this? A new voice sounded from the doorway as someone walked in. Because you're next on the surgery table. Ruth spun, and to her horror, she saw Sahar strolling up, a smirk on her face. You belong in the light, Ruth, and I'm going to make sure you join me in it. Chapter 20. Remiel pulled her gaze away from the surgery room for the first time since entering the viewing area. She is not next. Don't scare the girl, Sahakiel. Saha, or Sahakiel apparently, didn't stop grinning predatorily at Ruth. Oh, come on, Remiel. She's the perfect candidate. So you've said a number of times so far. Need I remind you that our attention and prayers be focused on Dr. Rains for the time being? Sahar waved a hand dismissively. Didn't you say he'd be fine? He's the perfect fit for Matariel after all, angel of rain and all that. Every time Sahar opened her mouth, Ruth got more and more nervous. It had always been clear to Ruth that the woman had a screw loose, but the idea that other people seemed to be buying into the delusions as well made her incredibly terrified. At least Barbara was looking at them doubtfully. Remiel only shook her head. The possibility is strong, but God will do as he must. I am simply his humble observer. Sahar threw her arm around Ruth like they were good friends. Well, I'm sure he'll be fine. We need him to do the procedure on Ruth here. Again, there are currently no plans to convert the girl. Even if we had enough liquid light, I sincerely doubt Dr. Rains would be willing to work on her, given that she put a hole in his leg. Sahar laughed viciously. Man, I forgot. She's getting everyone today. The doc and then Shatil. I'd better watch my back. Her joking tone felt completely natural, as if she was truly having a good time with the terrifying conversation. Sahar turned to Barbara. How is Shatil anyway? You guys fix his face yet? Barbara huffed, looking indignant. He'll be out of treatment by now. We had to give him a lower jaw prosthetic. He won't be pretty to look at, but at least he will be able to chew. Good thing he's the angel of silence. Eh, Babs? Sahar elbowed at Barbara, who gave her a withering look. Don't even have to try and fix his mouth enough to talk. Sahakiel! Remiel's voice rang out with reprimand, the harshest Ruth had heard her be to anyone so far. Do not belittle the oaths taken by one of our own. Sahar danced back from Ruth slightly, a playful grin on her lips. Wouldn't dream of it, Remy. Just trying to make the best of a bad situation. Ruth was getting more and more lost by the minute. She glanced at Sahar and the other woman winked at her. Well, if anyone was just going to blabber about anything at all. Sahar, what are the seraphs exactly? Barbara tensed, and Remiel just sighed in defeat. Clearly Sahar was a blabbermouth, and Ruth had pushed the right buttons. Sahar's eyes sparkled delightedly. Interested in joining up? I promise it's worth the price of admission. Sahar spread her arms wide, her pale skin on display. We are God's chosen, walking miracles who represent his divine angels of light, leading this corrupt world to a holy future in his name. Her voice took on a slightly manic tone, and Ruth recognized it for what it was. This woman was crazy. Yeah, sure, but I meant more. Like, what are you? Sahar's expression fell slightly, and she let her arms return to her sides. We actually are the embodiment of God's holy light, though. Some of us even have unique gifts. Remiel has the gift of prophecy. Phanuel can tell when people are lying. And I'm pretty sure Uriel can actually burn people with a touch. Ruth tried to use Barbara to gauge how crazy that all sounded. To her surprise, the woman didn't seem entirely unconvinced, glancing at Remiel nervously. There was no way these people actually had magical powers. Well, aside from immunity to the sun, most flash guns, enhanced strength and speed. It dawned on Ruth just how screwed she was. Superhumans were holding her brother and her captive. Her only friend, Jessica, was going to be killed by them, along with her father. Any chance of escaping the city was well and truly crushed now. At a minimum, Remiel had said she would try to secure Ruth and Ezra's release, but it didn't sound like a sure thing. And considering Sahar wanted to keep Ruth around, the odds of getting out of here dropped even further. It seemed like her only avenue for escape was to answer their questions. She hated the idea of giving in, but what choice did she really have? As she thought about it, she decided that finding out what they wanted to know was her best chance of getting information. She could always lie to them if the question was something she didn't want to answer, but she would need to be careful. Too many lies, and they might get much less accommodating. Time to steer the conversation in a more relevant direction. Remiel, what questions did you want to ask? The three women in the room all turned to Ruth. Barbara looked surprised. Remiel smiled knowingly, but Sahar reacted a bit differently. It was subtle, but the manic seraph tensed slightly, which Ruth thought was odd. No one else seemed to notice, their gaze focused on her. Well, I'm not sure why we had to go through this whole dog and pony show just to get you to answer a few questions, Barbara huffed in annoyance. To start, is Michael working with anyone else? Ruth raised an eyebrow. No, I don't think so. Unless you mean the government or whatever. We know about the GOA. They've been trying to send scouts through the tunnels under the city. But you're sure there's no one else within Helianthus that is working for them? The tidbit about the tunnels was interesting. Ruth hadn't considered that they could be an avenue of escape, but the massive power lines that ran under the city led away to different cities surrounding Helianthus. She would keep it in mind. I'm not sure of anything. Michael never mentioned anyone else, and Jessica never suggested we meet up with any other agents or anything. But for all I know, there could be others. She shrugged. Barbara pursed her lips. Very well. Next question. Have you received instructions from the outside? Has the GOA contacted your little group? Not that I know of, but if they were going to talk to anyone, it would probably be Michael. Given the timeline of everything, Ruth was pretty sure there was no way that could have gotten any kind of message, especially since they probably hadn't gotten the radio going long enough before Sahar had tracked them down. Very well, last question. Last? Oh, that was bad. Ruth hadn't learned anything. She needed to drag this out somehow. Where is the radio transmitter? Ruth didn't answer. She simply looked at Barbara, confused. The transmitter. Barbara frowned. Yes, you idiot. The little radio. The one broadcasting your friend's message to no less than 5 adjacent cities. Where is it? It took all of Ruth's effort not to look at Sahar. The radio was working. Was it still where they had been discovered? Why hadn't Sahar broken it? Or taken it? Was that why she had tensed earlier? Barbara and Remiel both leaned in, sensing her hesitation. Where is it, Ruth? Answer me. Ruth decided to try and leverage her position. If she was out of time, she had to push for more. You really don't know where it is? A vein pulsed on Barbara's head, her expression growing tighter. No, we don't. So tell us. Ruth tried to act casual, doing her best impression of a street informant asking for money. Man, I really don't remember. If only there was some way to jog my memory. Barbara grew more and more angry. Listen here, you little... Peace, Miss Lumen, Remiel interrupted before Barbara could explode, her gaze focused on Ruth. We do hold your brother's life in our hands. Is that not payment enough? Ruth wavered slightly, but refused to back down. They wouldn't kill Ezra so easily, not when he was another source of information. She could push this. No, not without some guarantees. Barbara threw her hands up in frustration and began to pace angrily. Saha, who had been very quiet this whole time, smirked at Ruth with amusement. Remiel gently placed her hands together. What sort of guarantees? Well, let's see. Ruth began counting off her fingers. I want me and my brother to have safe passage out of the city. I want Jessica and Michael to come with us. And I want money, lots of it. Remiel raised an eyebrow, a slight smile on her lips. Is that all? Well, I could also throw in new clothes, some really good food, a new house wherever we end up going, and for Saha to leave me alone. Saha burst out laughing. You're nuts, Ruth. Why would you want to leave all this? She gestured around the cramped viewing room, the dimmed glass still letting a large amount of light through. Ruth didn't bother responding to Saha, instead keeping eye contact with Remiel. The woman seemed to consider the requests. I'll need to speak with my superiors, but I suspect some of those things can be arranged. It will be a few hours, though. We can take you somewhere more comfortable to wait in just a moment. Remiel turned back to the dimmed glass. The moment she stopped turning, a terrifying, piercing scream sounded throughout the room. Barbara flinched backwards, nearly jumping in the air. Ruth did jump, leaping backwards against the wall in shock. Ruth couldn't see how Saha reacted, but Remiel didn't so much as twitch, as if she had known the scream was coming. It was deafening, agonizing, and unending. Ruth didn't know how a person could scream so loud for so long. Ruth realized it was coming from the surgery room below, and she knew that it must be Dr. Rains. Just as abruptly as it started, the screaming stopped. The light shining through the dimmed glass disappeared, and the glass began to become transparent again. Before she could even see what had happened to Dr. Rains, Remiel had already placed her hands together in prayer and was mumbling quietly to herself. Barbara looked below and her face turned green. She rushed out of the room, no doubt to throw up somewhere else. Saha joined Remiel, placing a hand on the other woman's shoulder as they looked down into the surgery room. Ruth was tempted for just a moment to run. But she knew there was no way to know where the exit was, probably the other end of the hall, but Saha would probably catch her in seconds. The best thing to do right now was to get information. She slowly crept forward, peering down into the surgery room. It was a scene out of a nightmare. Dr. Rains was nothing more than a pile of melting bones and skin. His body glowed with an unnatural light, like he was a dying light bulb. There was blood and bits of skin everywhere around the surgery table. The other doctors were absolutely covered in it. Ruth felt like she was going to be sick herself. Oh, God! How does something like that even happen? Remiel didn't chide her for her blasphemy, instead raising her head. There were tears running down her face. He was not strong enough. He lacked the faith needed for such a procedure. I always told him that faith was the missing piece. Saha rubbed the other seraph's back. I know, Rem, it's a shame to lose him like this. But that's how this song and dance goes, you know that. Remiel shuddered slightly. Ruth had never seen her, or any other seraph for that matter, seem so human. I can only pray his soul finds peace. May God keep him forever. Amen. Amen, Saha added. Ruth couldn't stop looking at the scene below them. Every second that passed only seemed to make it all look so much worse. It was too much. It was all too much. Saha wanted to do that to her. Hell no. Ruth ran. She shoved out the door and ran. Her feet pounded down the hallway, every thought except escaping forgotten. Her brother, Jessica, Michael, all of it faded as the fresh memory of that melted corpse filled her with terror. She didn't make it to the other end of the hall. Saha neatly picked her up by her shirt, and Ruth flailed wildly. "Let me go, please." Saha just grinned, carrying Ruth back the way they had come. "Oh, come on, Ruth. You'll need to toughen up a bit. Honestly, it's much worse when the dead ones start moving." Chapter 21. Ruth was left in a comfortable room. Not that she could really appreciate it. She was no stranger to death and brutality, but the sight of Dr. Rains had shaken her to her core. Ruth sat on a couch, holding her legs as the scene replayed itself over and over in her mind. If Remiel had been hoping to scare Ruth, it had worked. The idea that they might do that to her made her want to flee to the ends of the earth. Was that really all it took? Scaring her with threats? Ruth gripped her pants in clenched fists, getting angry at herself. She couldn't be this weak. Ezra needed her. Jessica needed her. She had to get it together. But the anger faded in the face of what she had seen, that ungodly sight. The door creaked open, and Ruth flinched despite herself. Ezra and Jessica were escorted inside by some guys who looked like Nosferatu thugs. The men roughly shoved them into the room before leaving and closing the door. Ruth wanted to get up, go over to them and hug them, but she couldn't. She just sat on the couch, unwilling to move. Ezra rushed over to her, clearly excited to be reunited. "Sis!" He threw his arms around her, squeezing her tightly. Jessica walked over, glaring back at the door. "They still have my dad locked up somewhere. At least they put the three of us together." She turned toward Ruth, her expression growing concerned. "Ruth? What's wrong?" Ruth looked up at the other girl, unable to keep her worries off her face. "Do I really look that bad?" Ezra raised his head, his eyes going wide as he looked at his sister. "Whoa, sis, what happened?" Ruth let out a wry chuckle, rubbing her brother's head. Her hands felt weak. "They showed me what happens in the Seraph surgery." Jessica and Ezra both looked at her with wide eyes. "Seriously? That's amazing." Jessica seemed to forget her concern for a moment, no doubt glad they had more information to hand over to the GOA. "No, it really isn't. It was horrifying." Ruth shuddered involuntarily, the image once again forcing itself into her mind. "They tried it on Dr. Rains." "Didn't you blow a hole in his leg?" "Yeah, but for some reason they wanted to do the surgery on him first. I don't really know why. They had something they called liquid light and they injected him with it. I couldn't really see them actually do it, though." Ruth took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "He started screaming after a few minutes. It was horrifying. He just kept screaming, and he wouldn't stop. Until he did stop." Jessica and Ezra waited patiently as Ruth once again shook from the memory. Ezra squeezed her hand tight, and she smiled at him. The expression felt weak on her face. "When I could see the room again, he was— God, it was so awful. I don't even know how to describe it." Even trying to find the words made her feel sick. It was monstrous, more horrible than anything I could have ever imagined. Jessica sat down next to Ruth, pulling her against her side. "It's okay. You don't have to talk about it." Ruth could barely bring herself to whisper the next part, but the words somehow made it out of her mouth. "Saha wants them to give me the surgery." Jessica and Ezra both tensed, their faces turning murderous. Jessica's hand squeezed Ruth's arm so hard it hurt. "Like hell they will." Remiel, that's another one of the Seraphs, said that it wasn't going to happen, but I'm scared. Ruth felt herself leaning against Jessica, but found herself unable to take any solace in the fact. This really sucks. Ezra stood and began looking around. "We have to get out of here. There's no way they'll do that to you." Jessica nodded in agreement. "They'll have to get through us to get to you." Ruth felt the warmth of their words as it spread through her. She almost began crying at how cared for she felt. She wiped her eyes, sniffling. "Thanks." They all sat together for a long moment until Ruth began to extract herself. As much as she wanted to stay there and feel safe, they weren't safe at all. The only way she could ever be okay after seeing that was to get away from it all as soon as possible. "Okay, that's enough of that for now. We need to figure out a plan." Jessica gave her hand one last squeeze before switching tracks. Her face took on a serious expression, her brow scrunched as she listed their problems. "Well, my father is still trapped somewhere. We'll need to find him. We also don't know where we are. Finding that out will help us plan an escape route. Then, she took a deep breath, and Ruth could feel the emphasis on this last part. We actually need to figure out how to escape from the seraphs. Ezra raised his hand in the air, waving it eagerly. Ruth melted one of their faces off. Jessica whipped her head around, looking at Ruth wide-eyed. Ruth shrugged but couldn't help but grin. He had it coming. Unfortunately, it seems like he's okay. I think they fitted him with a fake jaw, 'cause I messed up his bones. Jessica's expression did not grow any less shocked. How? I was starting to think they were invincible or something. 5 shots of my revolver from inside his mouth, one right after the other. Jessica began pacing, tapping her lips in thought. Proximity, sheer exposure. I wonder why that worked. Should it not have worked? Jessica moved her hand in a so-so gesture. I mean, no matter what the seraphs have gone through, there has to be a limit to how much punishment they can take. But honestly, I was expecting to have to use conventional weapons or something. I didn't expect flash guns to work at all. Well, Ezra's didn't do anything to the one I shot, Chate something. He completely ignored it, so maybe they didn't know flash guns could hurt them. Maybe. Honestly, this is good news. They'll probably have to be a bit more careful if the army decides to make a move. They have way lower aperture weapons than your revolver. They'll be hesitant to use it in civilian areas, but it means the seraphs will have to be a bit more careful about how they move around. Oh, actually, Ruth began, that reminds me of another problem. They're all crazy. What do you mean? Ezra asked. I mean, they're all insane, at least the ones I've met anyway. They seem to think they're literally angels or something. Remiel claims to be able to see the future or something like that. And Sahar said some of the other seraphs have powers. What? Jessica began pacing again. Obviously, there's no way that's true. Even if they could do human experiments to make people resistant to sunlight, with a byproduct of it making them together, stronger and faster, there's no way it actually gives them superpowers or something. Jessica stopped, tapping her foot as she thought. You said they all seem crazy. Yeah, like we are God's chosen ones, level crazy. Ruth made a dramatic gesture to emphasize the words, her R's sweeping out as she tilted her head back in an exclamation. Then she returned to her normal posture. It's really weird. What are the odds they're just imagining it all? I had that same thought, Ruth said, but Barbara, she was there with me, seemed to at least kind of believe them when they talked about weird abilities and stuff. Ruth paused, unsure if she should say this last part, but decided she shouldn't hide anything from her interactions with the Serpers. Sahar also said something really scary to me. Ezra bristled slightly, and Ruth smiled at him. She rubbed his head affectionately before growing serious again. It was an off-handed comment, and I'm not sure how much I really believe any of it. She said that there are times when the failed seraphs, like Dr. Rains, move after the procedure is over. A moment of silence hung in the air. What do you mean? Jessica asked. Like, well, they're not human at that point. Ruth fought to keep the image of Dr. Rains from her mind. If you saw one of the failed surgeries, you probably wouldn't think it used to be a person. But Sahar said that sometimes whatever is left over moves. Ezra just looked at her, horrified. Jessica nodded slowly. Yeah, we're going to hope that's not a thing that actually happens. She gestured, placing something aside, and Ruth was glad to leave the topic. So where does that leave us? We're screwed, Ezra asked. We're screwed, Ruth agreed. Jessica paused, then sighed. Okay, we're screwed, so how do we unscrew ourselves? They all sat and stood for a long minute, thinking. Every time it seemed like someone had an idea, they would shake their head and return to thinking. Ruth didn't have a plan, but she remembered something that might be useful. She grabbed Jessica and Ezra, pulled them close, and lowered her voice. I think there's some friction between the groups. Barbara doesn't seem to like the Seraphs that much. Also, I think Sahar is hiding something. What do you mean? Jessica asked in a hushed tone. They were asking me questions, and they wanted to know where the transmitter was. Sahar got weirdly tense when they asked, and I decided to stall for time. It's still transmitting. Jessica looked very surprised. How is that possible? Sahar saw it. She caught us setting it up. It shouldn't have even transmitted the whole message a single time before she could have shut it off or broken it. Well, clearly she didn't. It seemed like she was hiding something about it. She did let us escape, Ezra said. Maybe she's on our side. Jessica seemed to consider the words, but Ruth immediately shook her head. No, no way. She's too crazy for that to be true. I genuinely think she believes in what the church and the seraphs are doing. So maybe she isn't a fan of the gangs or the power plant, Jessica mused. If she's working to undermine them, then we might be able to use that. Okay, I'll take something we can use, but does that help us right now? Ruth asked. No, I have an idea of how we can navigate this place, but I don't know how to get out of the room. They lock it from the outside. Ezra perked up. Ooh, I have an idea of how to find Michael. They both laid out their ideas, and Ruth thought it sounded a bit risky, but they didn't have much of a choice. So now we just need to figure out a way out of this room. Then we need to figure out how to escape the city. There was another pause. Maybe your dad will break us out? Ezra asked hopefully. The door to the room opened, and they all spun with a mix of worry and hope. Michael did not step through the door, and Ruth was annoyed that she had thought he might for just a second. Instead, a familiar face came in. Johnny the thrall stepped inside, carrying a large tray of food. He glanced nervously in their direction, realized they were all staring at him, and quickly averted his gaze. Johnny? Ezra asked, walking over. What are you doing here? Oh, hey, Ezra. The large man was just as Ruth had seen him only days ago. He was one of the lower-level members of the Nosferatu gang who often worked to recruit street kids into doing jobs. Well, not as much work for the thralls these days. I guess we're working with the power plant people now. So we don't really need to siphon anymore. I've been doing guard work the past few days. He looked a bit defeated at the admission, and Ruth had an idea. Ruth stepped over, getting in Johnny's face. Despite the size difference, Johnny grew visibly nervous as Ruth glared at him. You know you never paid me, Johnny. What? You promised me quadruple pay for taking Jessica on a job. Ruth thumbed over her shoulder to indicate Jessica. And then, instead of paying me, you guys kidnapped my brother. Johnny couldn't meet her eyes, his body shrinking back even as Ruth pressed forward. I'm real sorry about that, Ruth. It wasn't my call, you know. Richard called all the shots, especially when Mr. Brine showed up. He got real desperate to find you two. Ruth made a sympathetic face. Hey, no worries, Johnny. You can just pay me back now. Johnny finally met her eyes, looking confused and guilty. I don't have the money right now. Sorry, Ruth. Oh, don't worry about that. You can pay me back another way. Ruth turned back to Jessica and Ezra. I think I just found our way out of this room. Chapter 22. Johnny was a huge wuss. It took only a few minutes of vague threats and harsh words to get him to cooperate. Jessica watched the whole exchange with an unreadable expression. You know, Ruth, between him and Marcus, I'm starting to think you're a bit of a bully. The words were spoken with a slight hint of amusement, and Ruth chuckled. I just have a knack for putting people to work. She patted Johnny on the arm. Johnny here needs some work. I'm giving him some out of the kindness of my heart. Johnny opened the door for them and quickly grabbed someone else from the outside. He yanked, and Richard came flying into the room. Johnny had told them he was the other guard for this room, and the group quickly set about restraining him. Johnny had been skeptical about this part, but Ruth had promised him several rewards from the GOA once this whole situation blew over. Jessica had silently warned that there was almost no way that would happen, but it didn't really matter. Johnny was an idiot, and Ruth could use that. Using ripped-up couch cushions and bits of clothing, the group tied Richard up and gagged him. Ruth made good on a promise to herself and kicked him in the side before they all exited to the hallway. Unfortunately for them, Johnny didn't know where Michael was being kept. However, he did inform them that the building they were in was actually an underground bunker. It ran through a large length of the city, apparently to be used if large chunks of the ceiling of the city ever broke away. The Nosferatu gang had found it and pretty much taken it over. It amazed Ruth how something like this could exist, hidden below everyone's feet. As far as she knew, most people didn't know about the bunker. Jessica had said that she knew it existed, but not where it was. It seemed like the sort of thing that the people in charge didn't want getting out for one reason or another. The hallways of the bunker appeared to be constructed similarly to what Ruth had already seen. Long concrete boxes with doors dotting side rooms. There were no other guards in their hallway, but Ruth knew there would be some further on. Not to mention, there were people living down here. The Nosferatu gang kept members stationed down here to maintain their hold on it. They had to be careful but fast. The longer they took, the more likely they were to run into a big group or a seraph. That would mean nothing short of them getting captured again, or worse. The problem was that Ezra's idea for finding Michael basically amounted to finding the guarded sections of the bunker. It made sense. The gang wouldn't guard something down here unless it was a prisoner. There was no need to, because no one else knew this place existed. So the group of four, Ruth, Ezra, Jessica, and Johnny, made their way through the corridors as stealthily as they could, which meant slowly opening doors into new hallways, peeking through to make sure there was no one in it, then moving as quickly as they could to the next door. It was a start-stop procedure that left their backs exposed every time they risked a new door. Johnny was fairly confident that he could get them out after they found Michael, but Ruth was trying to keep a mental map in her head as they traveled, just in case. The only markings the corridors had were small letter/number combinations that apparently indicated position. Ezra began noticing a pattern and told Ruth he could probably figure out how to get to certain locations if he had access to a map. It was another small advantage, and Ruth knew they needed as many of those as they could get. After about 30 minutes of wandering, Ruth cracked open a new hallway and saw some guards standing outside a door, clearly stationed there. They were just standing there, one of them leaning against the wall. The wall leaner was tall and thin, with light scruff on his face. He looked young, maybe just in his 20s. The other guy was older by comparison, and he had a rough, grizzled look that Ruth instantly associated with toughness. And Ruth had been hoping they would find some kind of armory before finding where Michael was, but it seemed they were out of luck. Their backup plan, unfortunately, was way riskier. They sent Johnny out into the hallway, and he slowly walked up to the guards. Hey guys," he waved awkwardly as he approached. One of the guards looked him up and down. "Hey, any idea when the shift changes? I forgot to charge my watch." The man held up his presumably dead timepiece. "Oh, I have a battery for that if you want." Johnny seemed nervous, and Ruth gritted her teeth in frustration. After watching how seamlessly Jessica could switch from one role to another, it was frustrating to work with someone who couldn't even hold a conversation as his normal self without breaking into a sweat. The guard perked up. "Cool, thanks, man." He stepped toward Johnny, the other guard watching them passively. Johnny didn't have a battery, and that fact would become very apparent in a few seconds. Johnny had messed it up a bit, but they had to take this chance while they could. As the guard approaching Johnny began fiddling with his watch to take it off, the three remaining members of the group charged through the door. They only had seconds before reaching the guards at a full sprint. The older guard turned at the sound of rapidly approaching feet, calling out in surprise as the distance closed. The younger guard spun, eyes wide with alarm. Johnny grabbed the younger man from behind, wrapping him in a bear hug. Ruth gave no more thought to Johnny, her full attention on the older gang member in front of them. He was big, and he looked mean. But Ruth didn't really care about that right now. He was standing between Ruth and her freedom, which meant he had to go. Ruth, Ezra, and Jessica had talked about how this would go down, but hadn't had the chance to put it into practice. There was almost no chance this was a seraph, which was good. The church supposedly only had 20 of them, and they wouldn't be wasted on guard duty. That meant they could try to handle this guy the old-fashioned way. As they approached, Ruth pulled ahead slightly, aiming low for the man's leg or groin. He reacted, his fist swinging down towards her head. Ruth ducked the punch, which stole some of her momentum. She crashed into the man's legs hard, but he only stumbled slightly, letting out a grunt of pain. She threw a fist toward his crotch, but faltered as he hit down on her back. Her spine creaked in pain, but he didn't get the chance to strike again. Jessica leapt, kicking off the concrete wall and decking the man in the chin with a flying punch. His head shook, and Ruth felt his legs wobble as the hit rattled him. Ezra took that moment to perform a flying dropkick straight into the man's midsection. The guard toppled like a sack of bricks, his head cracking back on the concrete floor. Ruth tumbled down with him, landing atop the gang member. Aside from the hit to her back, that had gone surprisingly well in Ruth's mind. at least until she turned to the younger guard. Johnny, who was bigger and more muscular by a wide margin, was actually struggling. The younger guard had somehow escaped the bear hug and was now in a slow, drawn-out fistfight with Johnny. It was actually ridiculous to imagine how this had happened when he had already gotten the man in a bear hug. As Ruth watched, the guard threw some quick, light jabs. Johnny actually backed up, seeming concerned about the testing strikes. Ruth just stared. What a waste of space he was. Not able to take it any longer, the group quickly descended on the younger guard, taking him out easily from behind. All things considered, they had gotten off rather lightly. Jessica had hurt her hand, punching the man as hard as she had. Ezra had a few light scrapes from the concrete floor, and Ruth's back ached. But they were mostly unhurt, which was more than they could say for the two guards. They quickly opened the door to the room the gang members had been guarding. They could stash the guards inside and grab Michael. Then they could hopefully escape. They all stopped, taking in the sight of a person they didn't know, lounging in the fanciest room Ruth had ever seen. A man lay on a long, comfortable-looking couch, eating grapes out of a fancy bowl. He had a book in one hand and seemed to be ready as he lounged. There was a 4-post bed off to one side, which appeared to be big enough for at least 3 people to sleep in. There was a full bookshelf, stacked with novels and comics. Ruth even noticed a record player, gently letting out soft music that gave the room a relaxing vibe. The man didn't even look up as they opened the door. He simply raised the bowl, waving it around. "I'm running a bit low on grapes, if you don't mind." The younger guard began to stir, and Ruth kicked him in the head. That spurred everyone else into action, and they quickly dragged the 2 unconscious men inside, dumping them on the carpet. The man lounging finally looked up and dropped his bowl on the ground in surprise. It shattered, glass and grapes going everywhere. He stared, slack-jawed, as Ruth and Jessica began rolling the men up in the carpet. Johnny's eyes hadn't left the man since they entered the room, even as he dragged the guards inside. Ezra looked between the 2 of them, a confused look on his face. After the men had been rolled up, Ruth went to grab the blankets from the bed to tie them up further, but Jessica's voice stopped her. "Mayor August." "The mayor?" Ruth turned to look at the man. He was rather unassuming, not really standing out in any meaningful way now that he was just sitting on the couch. Short brown hair, brown eyes, average height and build. Ruth had never seen the mayor before. Honestly, she hadn't even known his name before this moment. Mayor August shook his head, collecting himself before turning to Johnny. "Good man. Have you come to save me? Please tell me you're one of the rescuers." He eyes Ruth, Ezra, and Jessica dubiously. Jessica quickly cut Johnny off. "Mr. Mayor, we aren't external agents from the outside. My name is Jessica Arkold. My father is an undercover agent for the GOA working in the city. We've been captured, but we were looking for him as we escaped." The mayor looked back and forth between Jessica and Johnny, as if unsure how seriously he should be taking the teenager. When Johnny offered a weak shrug, the mayor deflated slightly. "Well, excellent. You'll be helping me escape the city then." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You were looking pretty comfortable there. The city got taken over pretty quickly, from what we can tell. How do we know you're not on their side?" The mayor turned his gaze to Ruth, looking down on her. "Child, I'll have you know that I didn't see the point in resisting, because there was no point. The dastardly villains who took my office had infiltrated the highest levels of government. They infiltrated the police, the power company. Once we escape, I'll stop at nothing to find out exactly. It's the Nosferatu gang, Barbara Lumen, and the church. They all teamed up to perform human experiments to create super soldiers and buy out every member of law enforcement in the city." Ezra explained cheerily. The mayor just looked at him, dumbfounded. That's excellent work, young man. You'll have to introduce me to your parents so I can—" "I'm an orphan," Ezra said, just as cheerfully as before. The mayor swallowed heavily before hesitantly speaking again. "Well, the owner of your orphanage would surely—" "Raised on the streets. None of the orphanages would take us," Ezra said. His smile was nothing but happy. Ruth almost burst out laughing. The mayor had paled considerably, clearing his throat and looking anywhere but at Ezra. He desperately turned to Jessica, hoping for some backup. "Perhaps a promise of a reward for these 2 could be arranged upon your rescue." The mayor took the out, snapping his fingers and putting on a politician's grin. Yes, of course, anything they like. Ruth and Ezra fist bumped. Anyway, we still need to rescue my father before we try to escape. Mayor August, you wouldn't know anything about where he's being held, would you? The mayor stroked his chin thoughtfully. I'm not sure. They don't keep me very informed, except to tell me when external agents from surrounding cities fail to come and rescue me. He deflated again, and Ruth almost felt bad for the guy. Almost. Jessica sighed. Well, we just have to keep looking. Mayor August, I don't suppose you know how to fight. The mayor looked indignant and seemed as if he was going to object strongly, but then he glanced at Ezra's smiling face. His bluster turned into subdued murmuring. Oh, no, I do not. Well, there's nothing for it then. Jessica snapped her fingers suddenly, turning to the two guards still wrapped in carpet. Wait, see if they're armed. Johnny and Richard hadn't had flash guns on them, but two guys guarding the mayor would probably be packing heat. Ruth unrolled the carpet, finding a collapsible baton along with two flash pistols. Jessica snatched one of them up with a twirl of excitement, and Ruth handed the other one to Ezra. She took the baton for herself, not trusting Johnny to wield the weapon effectively. They wrapped the guards back up, then went back out into the hall with their slightly larger group. Ruth idly wondered how many more people they might find if the gang was keeping hostages down here all over the place. Chapter 23. Exploration went less smoothly with the mayor in tow. The man was jittery and nervous, every new hallway filling him with anxiety. One hallway in particular had some people moving through it, and Johnny quickly retreated and closed the door. While the group waited for the way to clear, the mayor nervously suggested that they begin searching for a way out. We aren't leaving without my father, Jessica said matter-of-factly. The mayor seemed like he wanted to object, but Ruth sent him a withering stare and he relented. Honestly, he was more troublesome than Johnny was. It was their 15th hallway since rescuing the mayor when disaster struck. As the group was running through a hall to the next door, someone stepped out to investigate the noise they made in passing. A woman, muscled and covered in tattoos. She poked her head out, then quickly burst into the hall, shouting wildly, "Hey, stop right there!" Two others, both big, burly guys, also ran out into the hall. They didn't draw flash guns, but all three had collapsible batons that they whipped out as they ran toward the group. The mayor shrieked, throwing himself away from the assailants, tumbling over Johnny's leg and knocking them both to the floor. Ruth didn't have time to be frustrated. She whipped out her own baton, the weapon sliding to its full length with a satisfying crack. Jessica had gotten her flash pistol out and fired 2 shots into one of the men. Both beams of light struck him, burning through his clothes and burning the flesh beneath. One in the gut, another in the leg. He screamed as he fell to the floor. Ezra fumbled with his own weapon, not used to drawing it quickly. It clattered to the floor, misfiring against the wall. Ruth dashed forward after Jessica's shots, afraid of letting the assailants get closer to the group. The baton had a comfortable feel in her hands, but she was under no illusion that she could handle one of these people in an even fight, let alone 2 of them. As Ruth and the 2 gang members rushed at each other, Ruth pulled back her arm and flung the metal baton as hard as she could. The tattooed woman's eyes widened in surprise, and she instinctively tried to cover her face and stop. The man behind her bowled into her, and they both stumbled. The metal baton smacked into the woman's head with a crunch, and Ruth dove at her legs. With the 2 targets off balance, and with Ruth out of the way, Jessica fired 3 more shots. Ezra, having recovered his own weapon, fired once as well. All 4 beams hit the 2 gang members, and they fell screaming to the floor. The smell of burned skin filled the concrete hall, and Ruth's nose wrinkled in displeasure. Kicking the woman away, Ruth snatched up her baton, along with the 2 batons the closer assailants had dropped. There wasn't time to hide them. Someone might have heard the screams of pain. They had to hurry and find Michael, or they would have to escape. Jessica seemed to realize this, her face scrunched up with worry. Ruth jogged back over to her as the group quickly left the hallway. "Jessica, what's the plan?" This sort of situation was far beyond what Ruth was confident in handling. As much as she liked to call the shots, Jessica was more well-suited to this sort of endeavor. Jessica took only a moment to think before coming to a decision. "We keep going. but we head toward an exit. If my father is on the way, great. If not, well, let's just hope he's on the way. Ezra's mental mapping of this place had given them a few answers, along with the testimony of the mayor. Mayor August had revealed that certain letter/number combinations denoted certain types of destinations: storage, bunks, armories, and so on. But they also denoted exits. Ezra could tell that if the pattern stayed consistent, they were about 10 hallways away from an exit, though even the mayor didn't know where the exit led to. The chances of finding Michael in those 10 remaining hallways were incredibly slim, but Jessica was too level-headed to risk all their lives searching for someone they weren't guaranteed to find. Ruth wished there was another way, but getting to safety was their only real choice. Their pace was no longer slow and measured. Instead, the group burst into hallways, guns at the ready. They would only pause long enough to grab weapons from the floor as they ran. By the time the alarms began sounding, they were all equipped with metal batons and flash pistols. There had been some small burst weapons, but Jessica had said they were too dangerous for untrained wielders. A slow, drawn-out siren played through the halls as they ran. They were only 2 hallways away from the exit, but more and more people were coming out into the concrete corridors. It was now impossible to know if there were guarded rooms or not. Every hallway had people in it. The group simply charged in, mowed them all down, then kept running. The mayor was the slowest, older and out of shape. He huffed and puffed as they tried not to outpace him. They would make it out of the bunker, but if they had to run a great distance further, he would be a problem. Ruth would have loved to leave him behind, but he was a valuable resource they could use. Besides, if the city ever got taken back from the gang, then the mayor would likely try to find and punish the group of kids who had left him a captive. They burst into the final hallway, saw it was occupied, and all fired the flash guns. Beams of light flew through the air, struck the target, and did nothing. Jessica called for an immediate retreat, but it was too late. Closing the gap in an instant, Shatil the Seraph slammed Johnny into the ground with a crunch. The man was different than when Ruth had seen him before. When he had first appeared outside of the hospital, he had seemed calm and imposing, despite his silence. Now, the fact that he didn't speak only served to emphasize the rage burning in his eyes. The entire lower half of his face was covered in metal, like a skeleton made of steel that stared just below his eyes. It didn't move, but it gleamed in the light, the image haunting and morbid. He stood, his eyes never leaving Ruth, even as he stepped on Johnny's prone form. He stepped forward, and Jessica and Ezra burst into action. Both began firing at his clothes, hoping to catch them on fire. Flash guns did that sometimes, and they had talked about it as an option, but Ruth was confident it wouldn't work. Shatil had seemed like he was waiting for them. He wouldn't be wearing clothes that would burn so easily. Ruth didn't know what the mayor was doing, but she whipped out 2 batons. They extended, snapping to full length as she stared into the Seraph's eyes. He wanted to kill her, she could see it. She had hurt him, and he couldn't take that. He dashed forward again, faster than any person had the right to be. But he stumbled slightly, and Ruth realized Johnny had stirred and lifted his arm, accidentally knocking against the other man's leg. It was enough. Ruth slammed her batons against the Seraph's metal jaw, and the clang resounded through the room, overpowering the alarm that still blared. Ruth cried out, dropping the baton as a painful shock shot up her arm. But despite the pain, she started swinging the other arm, knowing that she couldn't pause for even a moment. Her eyes were squeezed shut from the pain of her arm, but she swung where the man's head had been just a moment before. Her strike met empty air, and she lost her balance. She opened her eyes, only to find Shatil crouched in front of her, his eyes burning with hate. He bashed her hand aside, and she felt something crack in her arm. She cried out again, both arms now flaring with pain. Jessica and Ezra had started hitting him with their batons at some point, but he didn't seem to notice them. His hands reached up and wrapped around her neck. Then he squeezed. There wasn't a gradual feeling of losing the ability to breathe. All at once, her body knew for a fact that she would never take another breath ever again. She flailed desperately as he lifted her into the air by her neck. She beat as his hands, even as Jessica and Ezra slammed against his arms with the batons. His body was like iron, absorbing the blows with ease as he stared at Ruth. She was going to die. There was no way she could escape this man's grasp. He was beyond human, a monster that surpassed all logic. But she still fought, she still thrashed. Her mouth opened and she bared her teeth, a silent scream of defiance as he clutched her dying form. Then his hands were simply gone from her neck. She fell to the floor, gasping for air that couldn't come quick enough. Her throat burned and felt like it had been bent into the wrong shape. Her left arm screamed in pain from when she had landed on it just now, but she looked up, confused. Saha stood in front of her, holding Chatail's neck in a parody of what he had just done to Ruth. There was another man with her, a huge, muscled man who must have been nearly 7 feet tall. His hands were on Chatail's face, and the metal jaw glowed red-hot beneath his touch. Ruth didn't know what she was seeing. She didn't know what was happening. Why was Saha here? Why were these two fighting against Chatail? "Bad Tay, I told you that I like Ruth. She's going to join us someday," Saha said. Her tone was like that of a disappointed parent scolding a misbehaving child. Chatail struggled, his arms landing powerful blows against Saha as she held him aloft by his throat. The giant man grunted in annoyance, and the metal jaw that was Chatail's lower face glowed even hotter. He flailed in obvious pain, then let his arms fall limply to his sides. Saha released him immediately, the giant man backing off as well. She waited for a moment, watching Chatail carefully before turning to Ruth. "Hey, Ruth, trying to escape?" Jessica and Ezra had stopped their attacks. Johnny was still on the floor, groaning quietly. The mayor was probably cowering in the corner behind her. It was over. One seraph had been enough, but now there were two, probably three if the giant was that Uriel guy Saha had mentioned before. They were screwed. Saha continued cheerfully, "Dang, you almost made it too. The exit was right there." She pointed at one of the doors. It was just up the stairs, then down the power tunnel. You'd probably be able to get a few miles from the city, then get picked up by agents trying to sneak in. Saha patted Ruth on the back, as if sympathizing with her. "You were so close." Tears began leaking from Ruth's eyes. All this, felt like a slap to the face. She had tried so hard, everything she had done hadn't been enough. She had failed. "Jessica could guide you north, which is that way," Saha pointed in a direction. "And since no one knows which exit you guys escape from, odds are pretty good you'll get away." Ruth just stared at the woman in front of her. Saha was smiling a stupid grin, one eyebrow raised playfully. "Oh, that reminds me. Uriel, Chatail, I think we should go search for them in another sector. What do you think?" The giant man, now confirmed as Uriel, nodded. "Works for me." His voice was deep and imposing. Chatail just glared at Ruth, then turned and began walking away. "What? Man, I sure hope we find them. It would be just awful for them to escape with all kinds of important information about the Seraphs and leadership of the rebellion. That might ruin a whole bunch of people's plans." Saha sighed dramatically. "Well, Remiel says they only have about 3 hours before we find them, so we better hurry." Saha and Uriel turned to follow Chatail, walking away from the confused group. Saha waved over her shoulder. "Bye, Ruth. See you again soon." Then they were gone. Ruth just stared after them, dumbfounded. She had no idea what had just happened. Jessica roughly pulled Ruth to her feet, and the action shocked Ruth back into action. "We gotta go now." She grabbed the still cowering mayor and helped Johnny up. So many questions left unanswered. So many things that didn't make sense. But right at that moment, all Ruth could think about was going through that door, climbing those stairs, and fleeing the city with Jessica and Ezra, the mayor and Johnny in tow. They all ran, escape no longer feeling like a lost cause.